You are listening to Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we discuss everything but politics. We're here with, for the second time, our good friend Timothy. Hi, Timothy.
Thanks for welcoming me
Also,
again. I appreciate it very much.
It's nice to have you on. Last time we did an episode called we called it Ras Temari, where we were talking about being self-educated in light of sort of black thought in the United States and what brought you here. How many years ago has it been since you've
15.
been?
After
15.
I missed out.
15.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of based on a quest that from interest in Ethiopia from a young age.
Yeah, and actually, when I first really started thinking about it, was just post high school, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
When I graduated high school, and I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I had letters from every university in the country,
Right.
but engineering department, law, medical, but I just had no clue what I wanted to do post high school. So I took a year off. I followed the band Parliament Funkadelic in northeastern Ohio. They did about a series of shows in Youngstown.
Parliament Funkadelic.
Yeah.
They're a funk and soul band.
Yeah. That's
what is this? The 70s.
They are the preeminent funk and soul band. Like
Yeah.
post James Brown and Sly Stone, it was P Funk.
Okay. So 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Good. Okay, great. And so this is our second episode on Ottawa. Yesterday was Ottawa. We had Iman in here, and we were talking about Ottawa as far as from sort of philosophical, talking about resistance to colonialism and how that resistance is often a matter of thought, because colonialism is often about mind control, or about letting somebody else not only take over your mind, but sort of do the work for you. Not in terms of actual labor, but sort of do the work of thinking, of planning, and accepting their sort of supremacy is really the difference between colonialism and other forms of subjugation. It's one of the things we talked about. But given that you talked about, when we were preparing, about Ethiopianism as an early form of, or as a preeminent form of Pan-Africanism,
Yes.
what is something that you taught yourself when it comes to Ethiopianism and about the significance of Ottawa from the American perspective as well?
Well, again, it was very, very important for the whole Ethiopianist movement, or Ethiopianism as a thought process, because Ottawa put Ethiopia in the news at that time. It was like a big event. Prior to that, it was references to Ethiopia in Herodotus or the Bible or things like that. But this was an actual country, Ethiopia, in Africa, that defeated a European power.
Right.
So
To be distinguished from, you look at some old maps, you find that the Atlantic is West Ethiopian Ocean,
Yes.
and the India is East Ethiopian Ocean. The whole continent is Ethiopia, because Ethiopia, in Greek, or one explanation for the etymology of Ethiopia is the land of the black people.
So that's the spark of Ethiopianism.
Right.
Those blacks, especially those free blacks or slaves who could read, they connected the land of the blacks with themselves,
Yeah.
and that one day we would return to our Ethiopia.
Right.
So again, as a cultural philosophy, that Ethiopianism, it sprang from that.
Right.
That-
But in this case, it's also now it's a specific country that
Yeah.
happens to have that name, so it kind of goes perfectly with that. And I would imagine it's a precursor to Rastafarianism too, which has this idea of a black Zion, right? Like looking at the Old Testament
Exactly.
as the fulfillment of the Promised Land is not Israel, as was the way it's
Exactly.
interpreted, but rather Ethiopia, not Israel for the Jews, but Ethiopia for
or
the
that the real Israelites came from
right.
this area.
Right.
That's the thought. So yeah, so it became something that you could look on the map. You could see in newspapers. You could see, that this was an actual event and it took place. A lot of people at that time too, the apologists for Europe, tried to say, well, these Ethiopians aren't black.
Mm-hmm.
They're Semitic, or they're this, or they're that. But we weren't fooled.
Right.
We recognized that from its name, Ethiopia, it's the land of the blacks. It's
Right.
our people.
And also, just because Ethiopians are Semitic doesn't make them not black, right? Like,
Well,
by definition, if you're
They
brown
tried
skin,
to tried to make
Yeah.
those distinctions.
Right.
and say
Under race
that,
biology, they often did that.
Yes.
That Ethiopians are not quite real Africa, as if there's such a
Exactly.
thing as. But yeah, that is an interesting thing. The idea of that I think some Ethiopians buy. We were talking about this with Iman yesterday, where I was like, one thing that I find annoying, honestly, about Ethiopian self-conception compared to the rest of Africa is like, it's like, well, either we're the leaders of this independent, free black nation, which I'm all for. I'm definitely down for that version of Ethiopianism, or we're like not really like the other Africans, and we're like somehow different and therefore also superior to them, which I, you know what I mean?
A lot of people have that.
Yeah, have that view.
I think that began to change over the past year when they saw some of the same similar attacks against Ethiopia that they use against other African countries, against South Africa, against Zimbabwe, against some of the same terminology in the news was used. So people began to say, wait a minute. And then, the No More and the Hands Off movement kind of identified the whole continent.
But it's also, it became like a creed of resistance as a result. But do you sense, because I sense this as somebody who, in spite of my name and in spite of my blood, which is 100% Ethiopian, I suppose because of my appearance and my accent and whatnot, people make assumptions, you're foreign, you're different, you're this or that. And I've noticed an increase in xenophobia, especially towards anyone who's perceived as of American origin. And I've spoken to a couple of foreigners who were like, yeah, people are much more xenophobic, much more. Do you think I would say that's like an unfortunate side effect of what's happening?
And it's unfortunate because that's not who we are as people. That you automatically, but a lot of people were frustrated, I guess, and I mean, it happened to me one time that somebody heard me speaking English on a bus and suddenly decided to tell me, why don't you go back to your own country and all this other stuff. And dude, I'm in my own country. You need to back up.
And how many people in this country speak English? And I mean, there are plenty of Ethiopians who speak English. I mean, like if every single person who speaks, then I guess all the university teachers, since the university is in English, many of the offices are in English.
The ironic thing is, until I open my mouth, most people assume I'm Ethiopian.
Yeah, right.
Most people just assume Kashiye. Right.
You probably get that assumption more than I do, and I'm actually Ethiopian.
I get it most of the time until I begin to, and then sometimes because I have rudimentary Amharic, so I can, if they ask me, Sensat or Yet to Know, sometimes I can answer them in Amharic, and then we just continue, and there's no issue. Right. But other times, like even last night when I was speaking to a group of people, and the predominant question is, you've been here for 15 years, why don't you speak Amharic better than you do now?
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude, my job is in English. Most of my friends prefer to speak to me in English. I only have maybe 2 Ethiopian friends who insist on speaking with me in Amharic.
Right. Well, I mean, the other thing is, the problem with that argument is we don't have, I mean, we've had a lingua franca. We were talking about the concept of a lingua franca yesterday. We've had a lingua franca in this country for some time. It's Amharic. But even that is, so people are resistant, or they get resentful for the use of Amharic or any other English language, Romania, because of the politics. So, I mean, no matter what tongue comes out of your mouth, no matter what language comes out of your mouth, in Ethiopia today, somebody is going to be resentful for some reason. About like, why don't you go back here? Why don't you talk this way, talk that way? Right. And they probably get it too, so it might be some projection.
No, even in the South, in some areas, that if you speak Amharic, they all know this is a Romania country.
You can't do that. Yeah.
And that's just recent. It wasn't like that 10 years ago.
It was not, no.
So, all of those things, I don't let it affect me as my love for Ethiopia overall. But I do see that there are changes. Right.
It's best not to let it. It's just that the irony is that Ottawa, as you say, is about unification, right?
It was
and here we are dividing.
That was the thing about Ottawa. Is not only did it unify the people of the country in Ethiopia, but black people all over the world identified with this victory. So it was not just Ethiopian geographically. No. It was an Ethiopian worldwide victory.
Not just Africans, not just black people, and I would even go further, not even just black people, but people who believe in injustice or in resistance. You meet plenty of white people who at least are trying, or plenty of people of other groups who have been oppressed, who find some identification or believe in the cause of liberation. Just like people who just kind of like think the right way, or who believe in resistance, or who have some kind of rebel in them. Ottawa is going to reverberate. It's going to resonate with them.
Yeah, and you have a lot of white people who are Rastas, from Europe and from America and from South America. You have, as you said, white freedom-loving people who they made choices to work for charities or NGOs or things here on the continent because they're in their own way resisting what they've been taught, the white privilege and the white supremacy that they were taught. So the fact that they're here oftentimes is because they've chosen to separate from their mother country because of the way that the racism and those things that exist there. Right. And then for them to be, like a friend of mine told me, if he doesn't wear his Haile Selassie shirt, somebody spit on him the other day, oh, French, no more. He said no more. Yeah, and he's a teacher here. Right. He's been here for like almost 10 years.
Oh God, that's awful.
He's a teacher, and he's a Rasta, but he doesn't have dreadlocks. So when he has his tie on and he's going to school, sometimes he'll pass people that'll give him some attitude.
Well, I mean, the irony being, a lot of people who do that would love the opportunity to go to the West and believe that the West is paradise, and then people like you and I, and probably even this guy who's white, chose willingly to come here, right? So it's like, really, which one of us is more aligned with the idea that this is the place to be? This is where we'd rather not only be, but where we'd rather invest our time and our labor and
our efforts, our money, whatever.
Exactly.
This is it for us, but they don't see that. They just see, and sometimes it's a little pocket jealousy too.
A little bit, yeah.
Right? You're here and I want to go there, and I can't go there, but you come here. Oh, well, it's like that attitude. You get that,
which is understandable. I don't begrudge anybody that attitude, but
I tell them that if you've never been, you should talk to somebody who's been before you. Up and go before you form opinions.
Yeah, just don't think
form an opinion based off of television.
Right. Don't think that when you go there that it's some kind of paradise land. Yeah. But I've noticed that for some people, it's very helpful to them. To believe that all of their problems and all of their personal are well, not just that, but that they are attributable, unfortunately, to Ethiopia. This is a very self-hating. It's like, oh, this country. If I just went, and they'll assume if I have a problem with it, they'll be like, well, that's because everything over there is perfect. You think everything is perfect the way it is in America. And I'm like, things are not perfect. If you want to talk about bureaucracy, have you ever dealt with the DMV in the United States? You want to talk about, on top of all the racial stuff, you want to talk about the crumbling infrastructure? Have you seen the New York City subway? It hasn't been renovated in like 80 years, right? So I mean, it's not to the same extent maybe, but people, but when they do that, I think it works for people here. I think it helps them to put in their mind, like any problem I have, if I just went abroad, and they can kind of deal with it that way.
Yeah, it's
right. But if they go abroad and they see that it's not like that,
I think we talked about this before. So it's the grass is greener on the other side.
Right, we talked about it. Yeah.
If you're in your yard and you look across at your neighbor's yard, it looks better. That lawn looks better to you than your own lawn. But if you go stand over there, you'll see the same crabgrass and the same problems that you have in your yard. You'll see them in his yard.
And that's why people who travel often are the ones who have the most trouble dealing, because we have to adapt, but we also are aware that no matter where you go, the same problems, the same human crap follows you, right? No place is perfect. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's no escaping it.
Yeah, there's always bureaucratic long lines, and you have to wait and pay extra money, and then
infrastructure.
After you finally get something stamped, they tell you now you have to go to another place.
Right. Racial issues, ethnic issues.
Yeah, to me, for me, that's one thing I've not really had to deal with. Is only a couple minor incidents, and again, these are not racial issues like being called a nigger with hate,
right,
and not being judged because of the color of your skin. That, to me, if you live in Africa, that shouldn't happen at all. That shouldn't happen. Although, like I said, one of my first voice jobs, I was told that my voice sounded too black.
That's a
here in
compliment to me.
Ethiopia.
Yeah, because I always get my voice sounds white. People are like, "Oh, you sound white. You sound white," and I'm always like, you know what I'm resistant to? I'll say this real quick.
What does a sound look like?
Well, yeah. That's a beautiful way of putting it. I love that. Did you make that up?
No.
Okay.
Actually, I heard this. It was a paraphrase on somebody, but I mean,
that's a great way.
What color is a sound?
What does a sound look like?
What does a sound look like? What color is sound?
That's good. Because I when I went to the States after having grown up mostly in West Africa, it was mostly the white kids there, these suburbanites who knew nothing about black people except what they saw on TV, who were the ones. It wasn't black people who would shame me and say, "You sound white, you sound white," and I'd be like, "Which one of us is self-hating? You're mocking me by saying I seem like you." So which one of us is self-hating? And then the other thing is like the idea that I would change my behavior. And I know why people did it. They did it to fit in. I get it. Because what people think about you, what they assume about you, does have an effect on your life. But the idea that I would need people who know nothing, even the black people there didn't know as much, but certainly the white kids knew nothing in high school, whatever, in the States, about what black people were really like. When I had grown up in Africa and been to a bunch of, the idea that I would conform to their reductive ideas of what a black person, all of which are disseminated from a white media that, assuming that it's not even a conspiracy thing, the people who run those media, they also have no exposure to black people. And the stereotype, the imagery that they're sending out there, all of those ideas of blackness are not compatible with advancing along any kind of viable path to success, be it academic, be it professional, right? Everything is antithetical to you behaving in a way that's going to lead to academic or professional success. So why on earth would I conform to that? Mm-hmm.
I understand. When I first started doing extra work in Los Angeles, I used to live in Los Angeles, and I was an extra on TV, on movies and music videos. But when I first started doing those jobs, they would always send me to, they always say I was either a criminal or a homeless person. Like they didn't consider dreadlocks in any other context.
Right.
But criminal or homeless. I had to...
You were never an extra in the corporate boardroom.
Yeah. I had to force them
Right.
to start to consider me for, courtrooms as a observer or a juror, banks as a customer.
You got the filmmakers to do that?
Yeah, I finally got the extra casting agent.
Okay.
Because I would just go up there with my picture and realize that, the ones who got work were the ones who engaged with them.
Right, okay.
And so when I started engaging them, I started telling them, look, stop sending me on these, I'm not going to be doing the homeless and every time in handcuffs. And, I'm tired of that. And that's not what all dreadlocks are. And
That's so interesting.
You got dreadlocks who are professional athletes at that time.
Uh-huh.
You were starting to see. Now it's all over the place. But at that time, you were beginning to see professional athletes wearing the dreadlocks. So I was saying that there are many professionals besides athletes, musicians, that wear the dreadlocks. So don't pigeonhole me into, Hill Street Blues, you're in a lineup, or this one, you're in that, or you're on a homeless person. And I said, you all need to stop casting me in those directions and start giving me upper scale and middle scale jobs, because always, you're low scale, they would just assume that, that's, people don't see that. They don't see you as that. I said, but they don't see us as that because you keep casting us that way.
Right.
And finally, I broke through with one guy. He started making me, he sent me on this show called L.A. Law.
Yeah.
And the second assistant director at L.A. Law, who was in charge of the extras, liked my look so much that, he put a blazer on me, gave me some glasses, and not with the lens in there so it wouldn't reflect off. But he said, I want you to every time you come, wear a jacket or a sweater and bring a notebook like you're a law student taking notes.
Ah, nice.
Like,
what era is this? Like the 80s, 90s?
Yeah, 80s.
That's so interesting because that's, I would say there's been some progress.
Yeah, since then.
Yeah, since then.
That was when I first started doing extra work in Hollywood. And like I said, that was the norm. Was the first few jobs that I got was, homeless, vagrant, criminal, la-di-da.
You made your contribution to the redemption of black image. You know,
Yeah,
black
I was,
image. Yeah,
I was like, look, this has to stop.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I understand there are some black people who are criminals and who are homeless and but not all of us are.
What do you think of speaking of black imagery? What do you think of BET, Black Entertainment Television? You're not a fan.
When it first came out, I was full of hope.
Right. For those who don't know, I mean, I think they even have a version of it on the DSTV here now. It's a little different. BET is Black Entertainment Television. It's a channel for and run supposedly by black people on
when
cable.
It started,
in the United States.
It was that idea,
right?
And the idea that there would be programming by and for black people was exciting.
Yeah.
Especially again for me, who wanted to get involved in the entertainment, especially the presenting part of entertainment. So a friend of mine, we even had an idea to do a video show. We wanted to do a video before there was MTV Raps and all of that. We had a hip hop reggae video show that we did a little treatment of, but nobody was interested in that at the time. Dreadlocks as a host, Dreadlocks behind the camera. They just. But the next thing after we pitched that idea, the next thing we started seeing was MTV Raps, all of these different BET had.
Yeah, sure. Dre and what was the other Ed?
Before them,
yeah.
Before even MTV Raps, there was what was it? Donnie Simpson on.
Donnie Simpson, right? I remember
Video Soul.
Yeah.
Video Soul.
Yeah, I wasn't around for those, but I remember the recaps of the. There was also something Jackson.
And
And
who else was it? There was one guy from New York, Ralph McDaniels, who had the video jukebox.
Right. So this was early on, basically. There was no such thing as black oriented or black run programming, even though the music. Popular music, almost all of it comes from black people, one way or another, but some way,
So that was the disappointing thing, was that what we began to see was that it was primarily music videos.
Right.
And then when they started doing original programming, it wasn't what we thought.
You're talking about BET?
Yeah, BET.
Yeah, it's a lot of video, a lot of hip hop, R&B videos, a lot of some of the programming is good, but Aaron Magruder? The guy who did the Boondocks, which is a show I recommend to anybody. I don't know if it's still going. They do a season like every several years. I know he's not on it and doing it anymore.
That was the thing. But
yeah, it was a cartoon, sort of like anime, but about black people and black issues and all that. But he took aim at BET. He hates BET. Like there was one episode where Huey, the young kid who's like Huey Newton, he's the conscious one. He goes on a hunger strike against BET because he's like, BET is ruining,
black culture.
Black culture. It's giving us the wrong values and so on. He loses and he ends up eating at the end of the episode, I think. And there's the great episode in season 1. Do you ever see the alternate history where Martin Luther King Jr. comes back to or not? He ends up wasn't killed. He goes into a coma instead of being killed. And in '68, he wakes up in 2003 or whenever the episode was made, and he's an old man in his 70s. People forget, like he died at 39, so he would have been. He would have been in his 70s in the 2000s or 60s in the 2000s. Martin Luther King could very well still be around now. It wouldn't be impossible.
Harry Belafonte still is.
Yeah, there you go, and they're about the same age, right? So he wakes up and he goes on he's real disappointed, quietly disappointed in the direction that the community's going. So this is Magruder talking about how Black Americans have lost their way, and then at one point, he kind of breaks down and lets loose all of his anger. And one of the things he says is Black Entertainment Television is in his Martin Luther King delivery. Black Entertainment Television is the worst thing I've ever seen in my whole life, right? But there is this question about image.
Again, I think the idea of it was good, but what they started to do is just basically mimic what MTV was doing.
Right.
And then the reality shows came, and then it was, and it became where what was popular was those images that weren't as positive.
Right. Because that's what makes money. It's money-driven business.
And so I understand the criticism, but at the same time, I have friends who worked for BET. I knew people who they thought they were making a difference. At least they tried to at the beginning.
Right.
And then after a while, it becomes just, basically it's a job.
It's a job like any other. Right?
Yeah, and so
it's co-opted like every other idea for resistance.
It's very difficult to have. I mean, again, you saw what the government of the U.S. did to the Black Panther Party. Right. That was a government-led police crackdown.
I'll give another example. Ethiopia. The residents of the term Ethiopia. You mentioned Ethiopia, and maybe not now, because it's been almost 40 years since the famine.
Oh, yeah.
But when I was a kid, you
80s,
mentioned Ethiopia in the 80s, 90s, even the 2000s, and Ethiopia, especially among the black community where Africa, you tell a little black kid in America about Africa, they're like, "Ugh, Africa," you know what I mean? Like, it's not their fault. It's that those are the images that I think that was intentional, right? Of course they wanted the humanitarian intervention in Ethiopia, but still to define Ethiopia along the lines of famine when no other country, North Korea has famines. Nobody thinks of North Korea as the famine country, right? Yeah, it was because there's a resonance to Ethiopia, as you said, Ethiopianism. And this was that cannot be a coincidence that suddenly Ethiopia meant, skinny person dying in a photograph. And we're still dealing with that imagery now.
Even that whole, again, it was tragic, but before Band Aid, the...
Live Aid,
Band Aid, it was, before all of that, a group of reggae singers got together to do a charity record for the people of Ethiopia. And nobody heard about that.
Right.
Yeah. That wasn't a worldwide phenomenon. But the song was there. Reggae artists from Jamaica and the UK put it together.
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah.
There you go.
And before, what's that guy's name? Geldof.
Bob Geldof.
Yeah, before Geldof, this took place. And so that was one of mine. When I was in Los Angeles, I used to write angry letters to the editor of the Los Angeles Times, pointing out some of these facts that and even one writer for the LA Times did a restaurant review, and it was an Ethiopian restaurant, and like he could not describe an Ethiopian restaurant without starting off talking about, first of all, people who don't even realize that Ethiopians have a cuisine.
Yeah,
because
food,
their idea is that Ethiopia, the whole country, is starving.
I think in the movie, it's called When Harry Met Sally. I think it's a very famous movie where Billy Crystal makes that joke about an Ethiopian restaurant in New York, because there weren't that many at the time. Ethiopian food. I didn't know Ethiopians had food. Just offhanded, like makes a joke like that, as if that's. Today that would
that's
be
how
considered
so many
really
people
obnoxious.
thought in America at that time. Right. That's how people thought. And
they never heard of the country.
This was a restaurant review.
Yeah.
Of an Ethiopian restaurant, and the first paragraph was about famine in Ethiopia. Right. And boy, for those people who can't believe that Ethiopians do have food, well, let me tell you, there's an Ethiopian restaurant in Beverly Hills that serves some fantastic food.
I'll give a contrast, by the way. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'll give a contrast, by the way. Nobody thinks of the Irish as the famine country, but everybody knows that they had now, it was a while ago, but still, the potato famine in the 19th century, which is what brought about 2 million Irish people to America. Yes. That's where the Irish community comes from. There were 2 other million people who died, who starved to death. And so the population started off as only 8 million people. In Ireland in the 19th century, 4 million gone. 2 million dead. 2 million go to America, and they didn't bring back their population ever until now. They're up to like 5 million. In contrast, Ethiopia was probably 30, 40 million at the time, and I think the population that was affected was probably 10% at most, right? But nobody really thinks of the Irish because of. The Irish are white for one thing, but I think there was a bit of a campaign of. Yeah, of course, humanitarianism, but also part of it was the politics at the time. I think we could talk about politics at the time, which is, I remember, you know who Alan Keyes is?
Yes.
Yeah, a black Republican. He ran for president in 2000.
I remember.
He came up with Reagan. He was Undersecretary of State under Reagan. He had a show on MSNBC in the early days of MSNBC called Alan Keyes is Making Sense. He was really focused in the State Department. I read the papers in the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and he had this focus on Ethiopia, blah, blah, and they were using the national question, which was a Marxist thing. Right, TPLF was a Marxist movement, but they of course don't mention that. Right, they turned that the conservative ethno-nationalists, and they bundled that. He bundled that together with the humanitarian discourse as a way to get at the communist government called the Dead, right? So,
Of course.
so part of that humanitarian concern was also a Cold War tactic of like, see, here go those communists starving their people, not caring about this ethno-nationalist group, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole focus on Ethiopia was not in the 80s was not purely a humanitarian thing. It was an orchestrated kind of thing.
Of course it was, and one of the blessings of being involved with the Rastafarian movement at that time was that we had members of our community living in Ethiopia since 1974. Like, so we were in communication with people who were in Ethiopia at the time, who were showing us gardens, like in Shashamani, and food at the markets and things like that, because Shashamani wasn't in the famine region.
It wasn't.
No,
it's Wadlow is the epicenter. Yeah.
So we had physical evidence, cabbages and like pictures, people who had gone there and took pictures of food in the market and food, carrots and all kind of food, tomatoes, onions, like food.
People thought there was no food.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty ridiculous.
But we had pictures of food.
But that's what the power of the media, the power of imagery
to try to counteract some of the, like, we would have meetings, public meetings of our organization. And that would be one of the questions when we talk about repatriation and going to Ethiopia. People would say, but what about? And we'd say, hey, look, we show them the pictures. Look, this is Ethiopia. This is our people over there right now. And then we show them a map of Ethiopia. Then we show them, this is where the famine is. Look how big the country is. You know what I'm saying? Ethiopia is bigger than the combined states of Texas, Arkansas. Like, most of the Southwest can fit.
Yeah. And I don't want to disparage the likes of Michael Jackson, God rest his soul. Hopefully he isn't guilty of all the things he's accused of. But I think he probably, when he put together "We Are the World" and all those people, Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, who came and sang and all that, I'm sure they really and probably they did save lives. And Bob Geldof probably did save lives. But that's the insidious thing about humanitarianism or about those kinds of interventions is it has that humanitarian, but consciously or subconsciously. It is also, it has either a strategic purpose or, in terms of the imagery.
But the larger society supported musicians and artists doing that,
right,
as opposed to leading marches in the streets.
Right.
So, okay, well, we got them singing in the studio about Ethiopia. That's better than marching in the streets about injustice here.
Right.
So it's kind of like, okay, we don't need to worry about that.
Right. I mean, perhaps, I don't want to say more significant, but another very significant campaign in the 80s involving Africa, which did bring some people out to march, is the divestment campaign with South Africa, right? And what was going on with apartheid. Hey, let's not think about the fact that the Reagan administration, as it did at the time, no matter what anybody tells you, supported apartheid, had Mandela and the others, and Becky and others on the terrorist list, the ANC on the terrorist list.
Of course they did.
And resistance to that campaign from the beginning.
It was largely
let's not talk about that.
It was university students who actually started pressuring their trustees and the university to divest because we'll shut down this school.
Yeah. Have you seen School Days?
Yes.
The film by
Spike Lee.
I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in college, I was in an adaptation of School Days.
Okay.
And an adaptation of Do the Right Thing. The director is a woman who now goes by the name Issa Rae. You know Issa Rae? Insecure. She was my director. She directed me, and she was a year ahead of me in college. Her father is Senegalese, so she and I bonded over that because I had grown up. So I remember being at the audition and being like, "Hey," she at the time she went by Jody Sejup is her real name, which is a typical Senegalese name. And she also has, I don't know how to put this, Senegalese features, Senegalese voice, even though I don't think she's ever been to Senegal. She was born and raised mostly in LA. I remember going up to her and being like, hey, you're from Senegal. And actually the first day that I met her at auditions, or the first day of rehearsal, she was there with a guy who's the guy who did Classic Man, Jadena. You know Jadena, the guy who did Classic Man? Yes. So he was in school with us. He was supposed to be in that play, but he wasn't. So that whole play, the character that Jadena was supposed to play, was played by Lawrence Fishburne in the film. Dap is his name. It's actually a really interesting film to go back and see. I think it's Spike Lee's first film. And it was a cool play to do in was this his second?
Yeah.
It's like, what was his first film called?
She's Gotta Have It.
That's his first film?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Actually, his first one was Joe's Barbershop in Bed-Stuy. We cut heads.
Okay, that's a short
film.
Right. That's when he just kind of started
after
shooting
that. It was
that's his first. She's Gotta Have It as his first feature.
Yeah,
okay, so
School Days.
Okay,
The follow-up to that.
And that was School Days. Kind of was a big. So She's Gotta Have It, I guess. But regardless, like that character is interesting because he represents, the scene at the end, wake up, when he's telling everybody drink. He represents the older generation, or somebody who's connected to the 60s and 70s and the militancy, consciousness, and who feels that in the 80s, Spike Lee's point is, we've kind of lost our way. Young black people are not so what is the cause now is no longer, the cause of freedom and Marshall Washington and all that. The cause now, as an alternative to, all the black people in college fighting over light skin, dark skin, good hair, bad hair, all that silly stuff that he shows. The cause now is divestment from South Africa, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what DAP is, pushing for, is the divestment, which is great and everything, but it shows also that, in the 80s, somebody like DAP, somebody like the Lawrence Fishburne character, is grasping at straws. He's trying to find some kind of cause, and it's not clear what the direction is. And I think even by the 90s is a little bit better, right? Or a little bit, but I think the black community really lost its way in the 80s, and I probably crack had something to do. I mean, what do you think?
That had a lot to do with, well, again, one of the things that Spike Lee points out is the upward mobility of black people at that time. The idea of pledging a fraternity, because the fraternity and sorority members were the elite of Black America at the time.
Interesting.
Right? Many of the Martin Luther King himself, Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy, all of those brothers were members of those historic black fraternities.
Right. And historic black schools.
So
Morehouse.
So what Spike was pointing out was that when those organizations were founded, it's because they were denied social life on campus.
Right.
And so they wanted to invent or create their own way, and they used the Black Greek system. But what they did was connected with Africa right from the beginning. They showed that the Greeks learned at the feet of the Ethiopians.
Yeah, and that Ethiopia is Greek, right?
So all of these fraternities infused African imagery and dance and things into their
right.
But by the time that it got to the 80s, it was focused strictly on, when I graduate, I'm going to get me this management job in this bank or this corporation and this. So that's, I think, what Spike was pointing out, was that we've lost our idea of serving our community. And it was just everybody trying to get theirs.
Right. I totally get that. And, there were other organizations. I think Jack and Jill was one of them. Jack and Jill was like a lot of people in college. When I was in college, a lot of black people, especially if you came from good families, like bougie families or whatever, you would ask, you'd be like, you just guess, like Jack and Jill, you were in Jack and Jill. It was like something for young.
It was historical, and it's something that especially it stems from W.E.B. Du Bois and his talented tenth theory, that a tenth of the black people can be integrated into society because we will be
co-opted.
That's not really the word. Is more, we will be. His idea was that we had to be better.
Oh, okay, I see what you're
saying. So that's why they focused on, your speaking, your diction has to be, and your manners, and your carriage, your deportment, everything had to be at a certain level.
Respectability.
And that's what those organizations taught.
Right. Well, but that 10% is that this is the 10% of the black community that's going to make it, and then the 90% are going to be left behind, kind of thing?
No, it's just, the 10% is going to make it and then have to bring
everybody. Okay. That's why I thought it was co-optation.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
So Du Bois came again. That was Du Bois. He was one of the authors of that point of view.
That's interesting.
But again, over the years, this was like, say, the turn of the century when he was espousing this philosophy.
But there was always a weird light skin, dark skin thing. I mean, there are correspondences with Ethiopia, right? And even India and a lot of these societies where there's a certain perception about skin complexion issues, but which is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, because even within families you have people of different complexions. But the perspective on beauty. I mean, some of these sororities and fraternities, they would have this thing where they would bring out a brown paper bag, and if you were darker than the brown paper bag, you couldn't be in the fraternity. And if you were like, I mean, I hear about stuff like that, and I'd be like, I wouldn't be caught dead like rushing for any of these people. I don't want these people's approval. I don't care if I get a management job at the end. You know what I mean? What am I selling my soul?
It's different if your grandfather
I got you.
was a member of it, and your father and uncles, and so then you feel like it's your legacy. You have to do it, even if you may not agree with some of the outdated notions or some of it, but it was a part of the tradition, a family tradition.
Right. You might even feel like I might actually go in there and make a change, make a difference.
I think a lot, especially in like in the 60s and the 70s, especially when the consciousness of Black people was evolving on a level, especially on college campuses too, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. I think that was a lot that had to do with some of the choices some people made.
Yeah.
Again, and what they decided to do once they were in those organizations, that those are different things.
Did we talk last time about Walter White? Not the Breaking Bad Walter White, but the original, I believe his name is Walter White, NAACP Walter White. You remember this guy? The guy who, I think we talked about it once when we met, one of the first couple times we met. He's the guy, light skin, like super light skinned guy. Mm-hmm. There's always that stereotype about the Rachel Dolezal or the Ben Jones guy, the Sean King, the very light skinned person, Benzino within the hip hop community, the guy who went at Eminem and saying, "Oh, this is white guy stealing," who is himself very, very light skinned, right? Like Walter White was an NAACP guy who was so light skinned that he was able to infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
And he's that guy. You remember that guy who was writing like exposés of what the Ku Klux Klan was doing until he was talking to one of the Klan members as they're doing the stuff they do, and they were like, there's this nigger out there. He's pretend to be one of us. When we get that son of a bitch, we're gonna lynch him. Good. And I think he ran away. But then, if I recall, sir, I hope I'm not being historically inaccurate. I apologize if I am. Let's say it's worth looking into. But I remember this from years ago that he ended up at the end of his career being like kind of giving up and being like the only solution for Black people is to start using skin changing product, bleaching products and changing their hair, whatever, and trying to become white people, which is a very disturbing endpoint for someone like an NAACP leader to.
I'm not sure that part of it, but I know that's a big trend among Black people, especially in West Africa, and in the islands,
and bleaching.
Like these creams that come out that they're promised that it'll make your skin light.
Right, and people get cancer.
But the point is that because of the discrimination in the society, many people feel that that's their solution. If they're just a little bit light, a few shades lighter, they would have more opportunities, or they would be, if their hair was straighter, so a lot of people did those things back in those days. I can't apologize. My father had the conk and the press hair.
They show Malcolm X at the beginning,
Malcolm X did it. Right. So a lot of Black people were doing it at that time before they woke up and got knowledge of self.
But it's also, I mean, if so many people are under the impression that it might help them with their advancement, then there might be something to it where, like, I'm not justifying it. I'm saying, like, where people are actually perceived based on their skin color or based on their complexion, their hair texture, such that it does actually affect your professional advancement.
It does exist. Financial, it does exist.
Right.
And like in the case of Malcolm X during that time, if you had your hair like that, then girls looked at you.
Yeah.
If your hair was nappy and natural, they didn't give you a second look.
Right.
So even just to get the attention of females,
right.
That also continued in the 80s with the Jerry curl.
Right.
There was that thing too that in the 80s, if you didn't have a Jerry curl, then you didn't get a second look from a lot of
everybody had it. Ice Cube. Ice Cube had a Jerry curl.
All of the R&B bands and singers had everybody had their hair.
Yeah, but the idea that the guys who started NWA and the guy who, Ice Cube is very much sort of a like Dap. He's like a Dap character where he has certain aspects of what he's doing that are throwbacks to Black consciousness. I mean,
he became that later, I think.
But he still had the Jerry curl.
No, after he left NWA, that's when he cut out the Jerry.
He cut it out like shortly. But what I'm saying is, even when NWA is called Niggas with Attitude, right?
Yeah.
So like there was already some aspect of resistance or some, and they're from,
Compton,
from Compton, from California. There's always been a reference but you're right. I mean, right around the time he cut his hair is when he goes at NWA and accuses them of, bending over for the Krieger, to Jerry Heller and many other things.
But he became more militant in a lot of his
Right.
writing and his
His
pronouncements.
writing,
It
his
was
poetry,
less gang centered and more black centered.
Right.
Just for a little brief period there, Ice Cube was, he did a lot of songs that were more black conscious, because again, that was a thing that was happening too at that time.
Right. Do you remember Bird in the Hand? Remember that song? And so that's from that era, Bird in the Hand, where he says, "Do I have to sell me a whole bunch of crack for decent shelter and clothes on my back?" Those lines. And then he became, like, again, you want to talk about co-optation. It's all of the more militant, the more conscious rappers within the pop culture who become the daddy or the cop or the whatever in the movies. Like, that's the roles they give to Ice Cube. That's the roles they give to Ice-T. I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that is a.
I don't think
there's
you're
a thing
far
there.
off.
Right. They took Tupac and put him in a movie with Jan Jackson and Jim Belushi right before he died. Right, where he plays a cop with Jim Belushi. He plays a lover boy with Jan, and he's a great actor. But there's something about that of like, here, let's take this guy who's kind of edgy, who's kind of has that sort of resistance vibe, that nationalist vibe, and let's turn him into, the boyfriend character, the father character, the cop character, the mailman character.
I think one thing, Tupac was aware of what they were doing. He was just showing and getting himself into a position where he could make his own movies and make them, because I think he would have made some dynamic statements later on. Like even that movie that he did, Kumo D plays the undercover cop that the two cops, Tim and Tim Roth, killed at the beginning of the movie. They
about Belushi, you mean?
Is it Belushi?
Because the one he did with Tim Roth is the one where they're running around in the bureaucracy, Gridlocked.
Right.
Gridlocked is the one. Belushi is the one he did where he died before the ending of the film, called Gang Related, about the crooked cops.
But both of them, because both of them, he plays a cop there's a little shadiness as a cop.
Right.
And I think, but both of them Tupac was putting himself in a position where he could be a producer of films, not just an actor, a name on the marquee. Mm-hmm. Because Tupac had that Black Panther upbringing. So he was, I think, of all of them, I was kind of really disappointed at the direction he took when he went with Death Row and all of those things, because I thought that Tupac was going to be the voice of the new Panther generation.
You noticed that pretty early on then?
Oh, yeah, right. I mean, because, again, I was kind of aware of his history. Mm-hmm. And when he even did the verse with Digital Underground on the same song, he's in all African regalia. Yeah. He's the one in that he comes out like an African prince. Right. And then he only has 8 bars, but he makes his presence known right there that, okay, I'm going to be representing Africa. I'm going to be representing, some realness. And his first album, Brenda's Got a Baby and Trapped and some of those, he's commentating on the situation of Black people. He's not advocating that you do this or you take this route, and he's commentating on what is happening to Black people. And but like he says, he didn't have a police record until he made a record. Yeah. And that's when the police went after him. Right. He's the first artist to ever have a #1 hit while in jail. And that's not a coincidence either. But I especially recommend the song Changes. Oh yeah. I think to me that really encapsulates like the conscious aspect of Tupac, and that's like his best, like one of those, talking about the social situation. Shed so many tears is one of my favorites. That one too, he did a lot of commentary. He did a lot. Even, Dear Mama and Keep Your Head Up. Yeah. He did a lot of commentary in addition to some of the other stuff. And even if you really listen to some of even the gang related stuff that he talks about, he's more talking about even the street soldiers putting down the beef among each other and coming together and battling the system, battling these crooked cops, battling, like he was saying a lot of those things.
I've seen YouTube videos of him giving speeches with the Bloods, because there's some theories that it had to do with the Blood Crip thing, the whole thing with him and Biggie. But like, he was affiliated definitely, and he would go and give speeches to these violent, gang organizations, trying to. I don't know how much we want to talk about this on the air, but like trying to,
change the paradigm.
Change the paradigm. Right,
look at things different. You've been brought up this way, but you don't have to continue this.
Sure. And that was the original idea of the Bloods anyway.
Same thing that Nipsey Hussle was doing on the other side. Right. So, but we noticed that artists who tried to do that end up dead.
Exactly. I wasn't going to say it, but, even Afrika Bambaataa was trying to, I mean, not that he died, but Afrika Bambaataa and the early hip hop movement was to try to use the music and use the culture as a peaceful movement to try to settle stuff.
That's what hip hop was.
Yes, that's what it was.
And Afrika Bambaataa himself came out of the New York, the Bronx gangs background. So he was instrumental. And if you ever watched that film, I think it's called Crush Groove.
No, I haven't seen that.
That film kind of goes into that aspect of it. It talks about, I believe that's the film. I can't remember for sure, but it's one of those films. And Afrika Bambaataa himself came from that gang life because he was a leader. He was able to use his influence to bring all those Bronx gangs together and say, we're going to have a party and everybody's going to be invited and nobody's going to fight each other. Mm-hmm. It's going to be all about Zulu Nation now. Not this individual gang. Every gang is going to be a Zulu Nation.
Coming together as Zulu Nation, right? Yeah. I was going to mention, there's also Pan-African tendencies at the heart of hip-hop. Not only Afrika Bambaataa trying to unite the whole thing of being Zulu Nation, calling himself Africa, but the fact that it's, I think we mentioned this the last time, that it's a Jamaican immigrant to the Bronx who actually is the inventor of hip-hop, DJ Kool Herc.
Yeah,
which is 50 years ago this year.
One of the recognized fathers of hip-hop.
Right.
It's the Trinity is Bam, Bambaataa, Kool Herc, and Flash.
Flash. I was gonna think, Flash, because Flash has the song, the Message.
Yeah,
right from '82. It's a little later. It's about 10 years later, but
the whole idea was to do something positive, with what you have in your neighborhood, to uplift yourself and your neighborhood. That was the whole thing, and the idea was love, peace. Having fun.
Right. I mean, Grandmaster Flash, you figure...
Unity, I'm sorry. I was stuck on that word.
Yeah.
Love, peace, unity, having fun.
Yeah.
Those are the 4 elements of hip-hop.
Right. And knowledge, I think,
knowledge of self came later, and then because of the influence of the 5% Nation, which was branch off from Nation Islam. Right.
Well, they believe that 5% is kind of an elite's...
5% is the the ones who recognize who they are, who know who they are, that they're the gods and the earths of civilization, and that the other 85% is lost and being misled deliberately by the remaining 10% or 15% that who know the truth about the 5%, but they keep it hidden, or they keep everybody from finding out about that. But those 5% who know themselves and know who they are, it's their responsibility to teach others.
Do you consider 5% as like a religion on its own, in the same way that Rastafarianism or the Nation?
I think more so than the Nation of Islam, which is patterned off of Orthodox Islam, but not totally. I mean, the Nation of Islam was more militaristic than anything. If you really look at it, that was an army. The 5% Nation is more about, again, teaching, and it's a way of life. It's not something where you go to the mosque every day. It's something that you wake up and you follow from the time you wake up.
That sounds
so. That's similar to being a Rastafarian, because we say it's not a religion; it's a way of life.
It's a way of life, right?
Yeah.
How large of a? I mean, I'm sure they don't have a census or anything like that, but how large of a thing, a presence, do you think 5%ers have in the U.S. or elsewhere?
I don't know. Like I said, my first introduction to 5% Nation was through hip hop.
Right.
Hearing some hearing some of the phrases and some things. So then I began to research and look it up myself, because I'm that type of person. Before I became a Rastafarian, I was looking at ways ways that I can identify myself spiritually, culturally, and individually.
Sure, finding yourself.
Yeah, so at that age, I investigate a lot of the Nation of Islam, 5% Nation, Buddhism. Besides, I mean, I investigated a lot of different ways of life before I decided, and Haile Selassie revealed himself to me. So that was my particular journey. I can't speak for everybody, but most Rastafarians come from people who were searching, and then they found this truth for themselves. Yeah. And adopted, or they find some other Rastafarians to reason with, or somebody says something to them that sparks something inside their head, or they have a dream or a vision that leads them to something else. Like all of these, we have these things in common. That's how our faith began.
How do you, when you say Haile Selassie revealed himself to you, what exactly, if you're comfortable talking about it?
No,
what
sure.
was that like?
It was again, we didn't get a lot of Ethiopian Haile Selassie in history classes in school. So when I started to, it was just through Bob Marley records initially. But when I started to just ask questions about, why do they say Haile Selassie is God? Why would they even think that? Like, where does that come from?
Where did that idea
When I started to ask those questions, I started to get people would bring to me out of nowhere all this material.
Right.
So every day I would find something that would point me in that direction.
Do people here have the same question? Because I think a lot of Ethiopians would have like, why on earth would you think Haile Selassie was God?
Even they don't ask the question why. They more ask the question, how can you?
How could you come to that? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
offensive to them.
It's a different approach. Yeah. Right. So, because if I get somebody who asks me a question, why? That's easy to answer.
Right.
How is not something I can answer for you.
How is it possible, or how could you come to that? How dare you, kind of thing.
And sometimes it's both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes it's not even a question. It's like this. This is. And I hope some people will hear themselves so they understand this is not something you can ask. They'll say, we know Haile Selassie as our king, but you all think this. Why? It's not. They're already stated their position before they ask you the question. So we think that Haile Selassie is just a king in our country, and not a very good one. So why do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a positive disposition about him as a king, compared to pretty much every other ruler of that period. It's true. It's just that everybody,
Because again, his international policy was much different than his domestic policy.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So
very much a contradiction between his position on imperialism abroad and position on imperialism at home. But that's true of Menelik. That's true.
Again, but if you have the idea that your monarchy is based on God has given you the right to rule, you believe that, especially if it's been centuries and you've been groomed to think that this is the way that our society has been ordered.
Do you remember the time that I think it was a British journalist asked him? This is probably a couple of years before he was deposed. There are these people halfway around the world who. You know this story. I mean, he's like, who worship you as a god. What are your thoughts on that? You remember what he said?
I know he answered that question a couple of different ways. I know first one, he said that it's not for anybody to judge anybody's personal revelation of God. Right.
But he also said, I don't think it's appropriate for people to be worshiping a man as a god.
I think he said that we ourselves are mortal and that we're going to return to the mortal coil.
Right.
So and we urge them to learn about the Ethiopian faith.
Right. Which is why there's a good, 10% of the Jamaican, a large number of people, including friends of mine from Jersey, who are Jamaicans, who are Ethiopian Orthodox. They're not Rastafarians. They're Ethiopian Orthodox Christians.
Yes.
Who are very much interested in the culture, and they name their sons, these traditional Amharic names, and they are Ethiopian, but they're Jamaicans. They're not Rastafarians.
They're not Rastafarians at all. They're Ethiopian Orthodox.
So they decided to follow what Haile Selassie said at that
moment. Exactly.
But the other statement that he
not only that, but Haile Selassie sent Abuna Ishak to Jamaica. to open a Orthodox church there.
Right.
And then he also went to New York and did the same thing in Florida.
Right.
So a lot of people who met or knew Abu Ishaq or his disciples, there were many African Americans who were his disciples, who spread out throughout the U.S. and started Ethiopian Orthodox churches.
Right.
So there's a lot of Black community Ethiopian Orthodox churches.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And I remember seeing Jamaicans sitting there, with the dreads. Trinidadians in our churches and in Orthodox churches. There's Mariam and other places like that. The Abyssinian Church, which unfortunately is no longer there at Riverside, on the Upper West Side near Columbia University. They moved to the Bronx.
Okay.
But there was always a couple of people clearly not Ethiopian Jamaicans sitting and reading Amharic and I was like, wow, it's interesting that there's certain people who are still
and a lot of it is because of Haile Selassie. Because again, everybody who examines his life recognizes that he was a very great man.
Right.
That the things that he did and spoke about some of them were unusual for most world leaders. You know what I'm saying? He was non-aligned during the height of the Cold War. He engaged with Russia, China, Czechoslovakia, and U.S. and Canada, and he talked to everybody. He didn't discriminate, and he was part of a non-aligned. There was a non-aligned conference that he was one of the key speakers for. So a lot of times they don't want you to know that. Most people think that they can divide the history and say in the 60s it was just Russia versus America. But in that time, a lot of people were not aligned in either camp.
It did seem, though, that he had some pretty close ties to the U.S., especially with the information, the hub that they had in Asmara and so on, that at least at some point, he kind of, even if he kept open mind,
utilized the U.S.
Right.
Because if somebody comes and says, "Here, I'm going to give you a bunch of money," and
sure.
Most of the time you're going to, but still you have to, watch them very carefully.
Yeah.
And again, if you read his statements about non-alignment, even though he was a friend of the U.S., he was also a friend of the Russian too. He was not discriminatory as far as who he'd take his money from.
Pretty close with with Yugoslavia.
Even
because of the Orthodox connection, Tito used to come here and
Serbia,
so on. Serbia, yeah. I think that has a lot to do with the Russian connection. Was over Orthodox Christianity.
Also,
it's always maintained a
Turkish connection. There was Greek.
Right. There were these large communities that he wanted to keep. Even the private school education, since we talk about education on here, one of the confusing things is the non-adoption of one particular foreign paradigm, one particular foreign modern education system, which some people could criticize because it would be good to have some coherence, even if it's in the private school education system. But all these private schools that he spurred, like you had the Greek school, you had the English school, Sanford, you had Lycée, and the idea was that not only were all these elites going to be educated, and many of them those young people end up being part of the movement to overthrow him, but partly it was also to maintain relationships with all those foreign communities, many of whom were dispersed once he left, once he was overthrown.
Exactly. So again, and he's saying when you carefully examine his legacy, you kind of see that he was different than most world leaders.
Oh, absolutely.
He was on the stage of world affairs much longer than most. He was the only leader to address both the League of Nations and the United Nations.
Right.
So
to make it through there,
to span that history,
right? And I think a lot of it had to do with, they say about him. You even see the way he carried. Listen, he was a royal from the beginning. He was always, related to Menelik and so on. But they say, from 3 years old, he just always stood straight and, spoke acted like a king. He had that in his personality. He had a destiny.
He wasn't in direct line.
No, he was not.
But at the same time, he moved as if he had a destiny.
Right.
And there was one particular incident where he was in a boat with his cousin or something, and the boat capsized.
Yeah.
And they thought that everybody in the boat drowned.
Yeah.
But then he comes walking up out of the water, and one of his cousins who witnessed it began to prophesy at that time. You are going to be great. Something is,
Right.
like from that time.
Right.
And even after his father passed, which again, and there were questions about that, but and then he was in Menelik's court from that time. And they said that he was often sometimes, picked on, bullied, but he always kept his dignity.
Yeah.
And so again, when my personal experience, we never grew up in Black America learning about Haile Selassie, but once I started to research and check into the things I found out, this made me more want to know more about it.
Yeah, and I mean the answers to the quote, at least the answer that he gave in that particular interview was, I don't think it's appropriate for human beings to worship a man as a god, which there's a certain irony to, right, coming from a Christian, right? But and on some level, there's often an anthropomorphic aspect of man becoming God or God becoming man in pretty much every major either monotheistic or of course polytheistic religions. So that's an interesting aspect to it, because people disparage new religions on the basis of they'll automatically, just because it's a new religion, automatically use terms like cult to disparage new religions. And what I would say is, whatever your thoughts are on some of the practices of, for instance, Scientology are pretty difficult to accept or whatnot, but like, it's not like there aren't practices, for instance, by the Roman Catholic Church or any number of churches that don't. And almost every argument that is made to disparage a cult can be made to disparage major religions as well. It's just people don't even put
all of the major religions were disparaged as cults.
That's cults, right? That's what.
Yeah,
right. The Romans. I don't know if I mentioned this with you. Did we talk about this last time? I'm not remembering what we talked about last time, but
we talked for so long.
We
did.
Time,
and we covered a gamut of subjects.
And it sounds like we're doing it again now. But the Romans, before they adopted Christianity under Constantine, right, when he died, they were calling the Christians a bunch of cannibals because they talked about eating and drinking the body and blood of their Lord. They said, how could you worship some weirdo with long hair, hippie guy out in Andrea? How could you worship a man as a god? They said they said that they were interested in incest because they talked about loving their brother. They talked about them as anarchists because of Jesus' pronouncements about the rich and the poor. And none of those statements are completely ridiculous, right? I mean, there's a grain of truth in that, just as there's a grain of truth in religion itself.
Well, yeah, and then, like I said, so even the foundation of Islam, Muhammad went into the temple there and destroyed all of his father's and his community's gods.
Yeah, as did Moses.
And so, I was going to make that analogy too. So.
Yeah, right.
So, everybody who starts a great religion that we recognize today started out as just one lone voice in the wilderness.
Wow.
So
often in the desert or some kind of some kind of psychedelic or some kind of experience.
Who's talking and gets a couple followers and then it spreads from there.
Right. So, even Paul falling off his horse, blinded by the light on the road to Damascus.
All of
those catharses. Yeah.
So again, when you bring it back to the Rastafarian revelations, it's very similar. The personal experiences that people have, you can't just dispute those. If somebody has like eye-opening moment like Paul or like Moses or like where suddenly there's a bush burning and speaking to you, or suddenly there's a picture that you're seeing that you hadn't ever seen before. And just as you're asking particular questions, this thing comes to you. You have to put it in order, like, okay, maybe these things are connected, the questions I'm asking, and this is the answers I'm receiving. So, Haile Selassie said nobody has the right to question the faith or religion of another.
Right.
Because it's a very personal thing. It's something that everybody has inside their heart.
Sure.
And even those who don't believe in a personal God, they approach their belief very religiously.
Right. And while I mean, he was consistent with that, because whatever critiques people make of us, that's, um, Ethiopian Orthodox Church was the official religion, but there was also, for the most part, religious freedom in this country. I mean, there was always the Jewish community in Gondar, and there was a Catholic community. I don't think the Protestant community came until later, but Islam. There was some effort at accepting Islamic law, or allowing sort of self determination. But again, a controversial figure nonetheless. But this all I think a lot of this still stems from, and a lot of the resistance in the 30s. We were talking about this with Iman yesterday, that like Ethiopianism, and you and I had spoken about how there were riots in New York between pitting Black Americans and Italian Americans over the invasion in '36. But there was already that precedent that had been established with Ottawa, that, hey, we can win, so that it's worth resisting because we've beaten these guys before. There was with Haile Selassie much of his ideas and much of the traditions that he, but while combined with the idea of, let's incrementally progress, let's move towards modernism, go back to Menelik and beyond that to Theodorus, right? It's at the beginning of the idea of a modern empire, which is kind of sounds oxymoronic. It sounds like a contradiction. Like, you'd be a traditional king, this traditional feudal state, and at the same time be trying to open up to modernity, right? But for 100 years, that's what existed here.
And Haile Selassie did, like I said, he wrote a constitution.
Yeah.
Which, again, as a monarch, as a ruler, he wasn't bound to do, but something he did.
Right.
He created a parliament at that time. Again, it was, people can criticize and say it was all, feudal lords or whatever, but it was more of an attempt at parliamentary government than any time before in Ethiopian history.
Yeah.
And then again, his efforts to join these international bodies like the League of Nations and things like that also was an attempt to bring Ethiopia out of the isolation it had been in over those last couple hundred years before that. Because again, even the isolation, they thought that they could quietly conquer Ethiopia during Adwa.
Encirclements,
and it didn't happen. Yeah. And again, a lot of it was based on, because Menelik was able to rally all of the people against it. Right. Because if you 30 years before, when there was Tawadros, was when the British wanted to come in, they paid and gave cannons and rifles to some of the regional kings and who gave them free passage to march to Mecca. So I mean, to where was Magdala? Yeah.
It's interesting though, I mentioned it yesterday, and we put the link on the description. We're putting the link on the description to Sven Rubensson's book, The Survival of Ethiopian Independence. You know that book? It's a history book. The guy died about 10 years ago. Sven Rubensson, obviously a European guy, but one of those people who was trying to say, hey, how about we answer this very important question of, how did Ethiopia resist? How did Ethiopia manage to resist foreign, being absorbed into the scramble for Africa? And he doesn't tell the story from the European perspective. He relies on Ethiopian documents, learns Amharic and so on. Looks at Ethiopian sources today, more present sources, and basically refuses to accept this. People make these arguments, geographic determinist arguments. It's because of the mountainous terrain or the landscape, and then they'll talk about the lack of willpower on the colonialist part. It's because the Europeans weren't really. And by the way, when I was studying, I will say this: when I was studying, doing a PhD in African history, before I interrupted it to come here at Columbia in New York, I would often get pushback from other Africanists, either African or Africanists, people studying Africa, of the whole don't think that Ethiopia is exceptional or whatever, resistance to that Ethiopianist mentality, they must think they're superior or whatever. Ethiopia was colonized just as much as, or subjugated just as much as anybody else. And the answer is no, it wasn't. And it's kind of upsetting to hear people make that argument of don't think that you're uppity or don't think that you're better, when the reality is, and I get why people say it because some Ethiopians do have that mentality, as we discussed. But the reality is as Rubinson points out, in that book, it was not about the lack of willpower from the Europeans. It's really about the increasing willpower of in a sense of resistance and a consciousness of foreign policy among Ethiopians, and a lot of that is the precedent to the resistance in the 1930s and potentially to the resistance that's, if there is such a thing, that we're seeing today.
Yeah, well, Menelik rallied the people around this idea that we must resist, which was different before. Again, because before, a lot of the regions were only about themselves, but he approached it as this is going to affect not just Ethiopia, but also this whole area of East Africa. Like, this is important. We need to stop them here. And all of us, I alone can't do it, just me and the show and the army, and we can't do it alone. We need all of the Ethiopians' support, all of the different tribes, everybody to come together to resist this invader. And that's how he described it.
Right.
And then the same thing when Haile Selassie went before the League of Nations, and he described what Italy was doing. They had been arming themselves and all Haile Selassie was asking was, according to the rules of the League, we're being threatened, and we need to be able to defend ourselves. So it's either you agree to let us now get weapons, or Italy is going to just run into our country. And then the whole idea of collective security and the basis of this organization is going to prove that it has no foundation.
Right.
And so they said his speech was very prophetic, but again, it was just a matter of...
It was just common sense, yeah.
Yeah, it's just common sense.
Right. Like, even speaking in Amharic, addressing him in Amharic is common sense. This is what they do in the UN now. Nobody is forced to use somebody else's language to express themselves in the UN right away, and people booed him for it. But it's like, well, right away, the idea that we're all equal members of a League of Nations, if we can't speak our own language at these organizations
and have translators, because he provided the translation of the speech.
Right.
But he said, in order to speak from my heart with the full force of my being, I have to speak in my native tongue.
No leader is made today. No leader is made to speak somebody else's language.
He set a precedent at that time, because before that, French was the diplomatic language.
Sure.
And all the ambassadors who went up to before the League of Nations, they spoke in French.
Sure.
So again, he established and broke the precedent at one time.
Right.
So again, all of those things are things that we, as Ras Temari, look at it and say, look how groundbreaking this person was.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can really challenge whether or not he was groundbreaking. Whether or not somebody believes in his policies or believes in him as a religious figure is, as you say, is a matter of personal opinion. But this is also what it means to live in a pluralistic society. And I hope that Ethiopians, this is the last point I want to make. This is really my takeaway from talking to you about this, talking to Iman about it, thinking about some of these texts I've written. I hope people don't confuse pluralism or tolerance for people who are different. Diversity is the term that everybody uses in America now. But, acceptance of people being different from you, ethnically, religiously, ideologically, politically. I hope people don't confuse that with succumbing or complying with imperialism. Or, you know what I mean? Like, we can resist and still amongst ourselves be pluralistic, be tolerant. Because I think that's the confusion that's happening now. The xenophobia that you and I are experiencing as people who at least come across as foreign. The tribalist thought that permeates the whole country, every sector of the country, not any one particular group. I think that this is being confused with, resistance to a dominion, when really you should be able to resist and at the same time tolerate people who are not trying to impose it on you, but they're just different, right? Exactly. We could kind of strike that balance.
Yeah, and again, even from Menelik's time, and there were African Americans here, there were people from other parts of Europe here living their lives, and so that's not anything new from the history of Ethiopia. There's always been people from other parts of the world here.
Right.
When Ethiopia was a center in Aksum centuries ago, people came from all over the world. Some stayed. Some just passed through on their way to other places, on their way to China, on their way to Persia, on their way to, but that was a center where a lot of people went. So the remnant or the legacy is that, we've always been a people that have embraced other people and other cultures, and but at the same time you stand up for your central identity, your core. You don't let anybody take that from you. But you can receive emissaries from other places, or ambassadors, or visitors, or merchants, that's been going on for centuries. That's nothing new. So, and we see what we were talking about before, that there's a lot of people coming to the country now that want to keep the Ethiopians out, and that's a new thing. That's not something that they did before. Most of the time they came and incorporated, married Ethiopian women and had children. That's why you have Roman noses and Chinese and Japanese eyes and all kind of things in Ethiopia, not just one particular look. There's many people who are amalgamation of all these different cultures and people who have come to visit.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking on our walk over here when I came. See you there. I'm willing to address this. We're in Bole Rwanda right now. This is my home in Bole Rwanda. There's been a surge in Rwanda and Japan, in these neighborhoods, which are themselves named after embassies and have large foreign communities, of these Chinese restaurants. I've said before, I'm going to just come out and say it. I've said it in private. I love the idea of foreign communities being. I hope people are not xenophobic towards it. There's one Asian woman, not Chinese, but who I'm friendly with here, who always talks about how people treat her, based on the xenophobia. But at the same time, there should be no discrimination of Ethiopians going into Chinese restaurants, as I've experienced quite a few times. And so it's one thing to discriminate against people who will come to your country. That's awful. It's a little on another level when you're discriminating against other people in their country. Yeah. That's I've noticed that is happening. But I guess the assumption is, for some groups, maybe they just assume, like, why would an Ethiopian even come here? What would they want with the food? Some groups of people assume segregation is like, you know what I mean? It's like the default setting. Like, why would we mix in with people who don't look like us, right? For me, that's very difficult to accept because I grew up my whole life in international schools, where like the default setting is that you don't care what. So everybody in middle school, when everybody started dating everybody, the black kids and the Asian kids started dating, and the the white kids were friends with nobody. No, I'm not saying it didn't matter, but the assumption was it shouldn't matter, right?
Yeah, it might not have mattered among you all.
Right.
Maybe some of those parents were expressing their concerns in their homes.
Possibly, but even them, like, if they were, they would have to be very careful because a lot of these are embassy kids or you know what I mean. So they'll have a little bit of a different perspective. But you're right. I mean, it has taken me a long time to wean myself off of the belief that, as great as that upbringing was, and as much as that's the way it should be, like it's a little delusional to think that that's the way most people were brought up. Most people are brought up where they have no exposure to people who look anything
that's the thing
them.
Too. My early elementary school in Ohio, where I grew up, and my elementary school experience from 4th grade to 6th grade, I was in a majority black school.
Yeah,
like there were only maybe a few teachers who were white, maybe 1 or 2 students at most. It was majority black in the school. So when we were bused in grade 7 to Harry B. Turner Junior High, that was my first time that I'd ever been in a white majority environment. Like,
right.
That was the first time, really. I had never really experienced that many white people at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And
at the same time.
Yeah, no, and then even like in my homeroom, there were, like, we could count out of 30 students, 10 were African American.
Right.
And that was the first time I was actually, insulted about my appearance. When one girl turned around and looked at me and said, can't you tuck your lips in? Mm-hmm. Can't you tuck your lips in? And I was like, what? Tuck my lips in? You know what I'm saying? It was like, what? And then I suddenly realized, okay, because, and then I realized, oh shit, she's insulting me. And I was hurt because I kind of liked this girl. I thought we were friends.
That'll scar some people.
Yeah, no. So I'm saying that some people will avoid those situations. They will stay segregated in their own communities. They will not mix because they are afraid of these type of insults, these type of
And there's an irony there too, right? Because we think of segregation for good reason as a racist, so especially as a legal policy or an educational policy, but like sometimes people really do that to avoid, well, as you just put
sometimes it's self-preservation,
right, because integration
Black
is when
America
you have
post-slavery, segregated communities were how Black people stayed safe. That's how they amassed personal wealth.
It's almost like a fort. It's just like a military fort.
There were places where. Did you see the movie The Harder They Come?
No, I haven't.
No, you gotta see that movie.
Good film.
Good movie, but it's fictional, but it's also based on some historical realities. But one of the points that it makes is that that some post-slavery Black people set out to set up their own towns, their own banks, and they were the law. They established restaurants, hotels, everything because they had to. They couldn't utilize those outside of their community.
Black judges, Black congressmen.
In order to have that, you had to build that in your own community. And so, again, post-slavery and what they call the Reconstruction, there was hundreds of those communities all over the U.S. But, one of the things that happened was that the racist terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and others would target those towns. Invent some cause to go in and arrest the leaders or lynch them or start a riot and burn the whole town down, or like these things took place. This is history in America. So a lot of the segregated communities after those incidents took place, became even more insular. Like we don't mix up at all. We don't want any of these people to feel threatened by us either. So that they really keep their, wealth or
segregation as a form of, ironically, segregation as racial harmony.
Yes.
Like let's all get along by staying as far away from each other as possible.
That was the idea for a lot of Black communities at that time. It's like we just got to get away from these white people so we don't get lynched and get killed.
The problem is that when Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision that established the principle of separate but equal, that these schools could be segregated as long as they were equal. It was very, very clear very quickly that that was nonsense. These schools aren't getting the same funding, they're not getting the same resources. That would be fine for some people to have separate but equal, but then it took a good 60, 70 years before you had Brown versus Board of Education, which was based on the notion that no, they're not equal, and young kids, Black kids, they use a lot of sociological evidence, psychological evidence.
They're being discriminated against.
And accepting the idea of white as superior or more beautiful or so on at a young age, and separating these schools is obviously not. There is no equality within segregation, right? And that's how they overturned.
In some, because some segregated communities, their education was very high standard. I was listening to, it was a documentary, I'm trying to remember what it was about, but I can't remember it. But I think it was about New York schools in the 70s. And one person, he said he had come from Texas or somewhere from a segregated community, but his son was a student at his school and knew math and Greek and Latin and had a high level of education. But when he went to the New York public schools, all of a sudden he was getting D's. And this parent became concerned, this is my son who I know he excelled in school in this setting. So why is he having trouble in this large city, in this public school, in this metropolis? What's the problem? And what they realized was that many of the teachers were not interested in the students growing and developing. They just gave them basic by rote education, and if the child had questions or anything like that, they didn't engage with them. They didn't.
Sounds like public schools, yeah.
Yeah, so it was, and so that it was became an argument between communities controlling their own schools.
Yeah.
Hiring and firing teachers and that type of thing. It became a big case in New York, in one particular, I think, Queens neighborhood, that the parents did, and they got rid of some of the teachers who they thought were not responsive to giving their children a quality education, and they were just there to collect a check, and they were in the union, so they went to the union for protection. And they said, we can't be fired from this school because I'm in the union. And even though teachers had been transferred before, they decided to make this one a political statement, because all of the teachers that were being removed were white, and they were being replaced by black and male teachers, which was something new in this area too. That they said some of the kids had never seen a male teacher before. And a lot of the teachers who came to that community were specifically wanting to teach from an Afrocentric point of view.
Right.
And engage the students, the black and brown students, there's Puerto Rican students in this neighborhood too. So they deliberately set out to have a curriculum that embraced and included the black and brown students, whereas some of the white teachers that were still in that school were just doing enough to get by, status quo. And it became apparent, it was glaringly apparent, that this teacher doesn't care about the kids and these other teachers do care about the kids.
Can I say though, I taught at one point. I was in a mostly white school, a private school, which I had also been a student at.
Mm-hmm.
My former high school. I went back and taught. It was a pretty crazy experience on a number of levels. I didn't stay there long, but well, I guess I'll say that the teacher, the same bosses that I had were my teachers when I was a kid. So I knew them as a kid. They were completely different towards me as white people when I was competition in their view, or when I was a Stanford graduate, when I was, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
When I was an adult, they loved me when I was a kid. When they loved having a black student who was good. But they didn't necessarily like it when you were grown up in that, in that same.
A black teacher challenges some
Right.
of the things that they.
But see, that's the thing is, I didn't say those things because I am, especially back then. Now I'm much more, I wouldn't say militant, but I'm much more conscious of these issues. I had come from an international school where I thought, it doesn't really matter. And there had been a black teacher, actually, I remember her name was Sarita. She's an older lady. She was one of the few black teachers we had. She had come out of it was in Senegal, so she had been a black American woman who kind of came there and was trying to reinvent herself or whatever in the conscious mindset, And they gave her a curriculum which included Rolling Thunder and Maya Angelou and all that stuff, Harper Lee, and the white students were getting angry. They were like, she's obsessed with this, she's forcing this down our throats. Who cares? It's in the past. What they didn't realize is that the curriculum was handed to her and she was picked for that curriculum. Mm-hmm. But she wasn't necessarily the kind of person who was, resentful or was trying to beat it. Or in fact, I remember having conversations with her where she said, I don't like Maya Angelou because this is now crossing over into beating you over the head with it, right? Like it's just too much. And yet she was perceived that way by the students. But, as a teacher, you can't tell the students, oh, I'm being forced to teach you something. You have to take ownership of everything you teach. Right, so I was in that position 10 years later, 12 years later, when I was teaching, and these white kids were resisting, and I was like, well, listen, I'm being told to teach Othello, I'm being told to teach, Richard Wright and all that. And if I'm teaching them, I'm going to teach them, I'm going to talk about race. Like, that's how the hell am I supposed to teach books about like that, without. But I realized that
Richard Wright, he talks about it.
Yeah. I mean, the book we saw was called Black Boy. It's the book Black Boy that he wrote. Which, how do you teach a book called Black Boy? But see, this is the paradox. Is like, even if you, as a black person, are not trying to engage in those discourses, if you're not trying to, like, you're kind of pigeonholed into it. And of course, the white administrators who give you that curriculum, they figure, well, yeah, a black guy should be teaching this. A white person's not going to teach this, or they're not going to be as good at teaching it. But what they also don't realize is, unintentionally, they're kind of forcing you into a box, right? And that's what America is. America for black, biracial people, for gay people, for women, for margin, it's one box after another, right? You are constantly placed inside boxes,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all the game is about figuring out which box you're in now, and how do I deal with it? How do I get out with it, or how do I accept it?
I get it. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting conversation, like I said, because my best educational experience was again in grade 4, where we had our class was 100% black, and the teacher was black. Her husband was an activist in nearby town, and she went out of her way to make sure we knew who some of these people were. Like they were contemporaries. They were people who were on the stage of world affairs at that time, 67, 68. But nobody else was teaching about them in the schools except her. She just made it her duty that, okay, you all are going to know who Ralph Bunche is. You all are going to know who Thurgood Marshall, why he's important. You're going to know why Dr. King is important. You're going to know
absolutely,
why Malcolm X is important.
Yeah.
She said, you're going to know why.
Right.
And Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. And she had us study all of these things, Daisy Bates and like the Little Rock Nine, like everything. She had us study everything.
That's great. And especially at a young age. But it's funny, though, because the way they teach civil rights, and now there's been kind of a reaction, an attempt to kind of restore Dr. Martin Luther King. Because, like with everything, they've tried to co-opt Martin Luther King. Right? Like Glenn Beck citing Martin Luther King. Like white people always, conservative white people always now are reverting to Martin Luther King and trying to use his language or whatever, and the I Have a Dream speech. And have ignored much
of the
his...
same people who were resisting him having his birthday as a national holiday.
Well, there you go. That's a great point. That's a really good point. But like, yeah. So they're trying to marshal it, but especially towards the end when a lot of his stuff was anti-war, when he's more and more radical, when he's making pronouncements like, we live in a country where you have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor, and budgets are moral documents, and all this stuff that he said. I don't know if we've covered this territory in the past.
I think Dr. King was a lot more militant, and by the time he got the bullet, and that part of his legacy is hardly ever touched on. Most people refer to that speech on the stairs in 1963, I Have a Dream.
Right.
And they even tried to say that when Obama was elected president, that was the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. And it was not.
But it's useful for them to say this. Yeah. Because as long as they can do this, they can just do away with the problem.
He never said anything and
dismiss it as if it's
about
resolved.
Having a black president. He
never
mentioned
of course not.
anything. What he talked about was his children.
Right.
One day being in a society that was not colorblind, but at least where children, like his children of color, were not judged by their color, and not denied opportunities because of their color, or not killed by police because of their color.
And also he in his biographical or his autobiographical writings, because he has there's somebody, Clay Carson, who I studied under, has an autobiography of Martin Luther King that he kind of put together. Dr. King never sat down and read an autobiography, but it's some of his, the traumatic experiences that he had, where this is where you also see that King came from a certain background class-wise, because he had the death of his grandmother, and then he was friends with these white kids, and then that friendship ended. I mean, he had a bit of compared to Malcolm X, who had traumatic experience after traumatic experience in childhood, that might also inform, why one is radical. But I guess the reason I mention all this is that you mentioned Thurgood Marshall together with King and X, and I always think to myself, one reason that King is thought of as this moderate, this hopeful, inspirational guy who is much more amenable to white people is that he's contrasted with X. Whereas if you start contrasting him with Thurgood Marshall, Thurgood Marshall's thing was, he was even more moderate in the sense that he didn't want nonviolent. Martin Luther King was breaking the law. Yeah, no, right. Thurgood Marshall was trying to stay within the law.
He was a lawyer. Yeah, he was a lawyer. Yeah. So that was even.
And all of them were effective in one way, in one frame or another. All three of them.
At the time when Thurgood Marshall was the head litigator for the NAACP, he forced a lot of issues in front of the Supreme Court. Yeah, that was, again, he made them look at these issues, whether they agreed or whether they voted for it or not. Yeah. They had to look at it.
To the point that he ended up being the first black person on the Supreme Court, and Johnson put him there, and quite frankly, that was that was a very important step. And of course, when he retired, I think he retired or died in '91. That's when you had Clarence Thomas, who's still there. 30 years later, Clarence Thomas is still there. Was a black conservative, and there has not been any other black person on the Supreme Court. Ketanji Jackson, I think is her name, who Biden just.
They just
yeah, I don't know if you heard. Yeah, a black woman for the first time to the Supreme Court.
I knew that they
and the first non-Clarence Thomas black person since on the Supreme Court since Thurgood.
Yeah. So again, but my point was that none of those things are the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream.
No.
Those, again, like you said, Thurgood Marshall's appointment to the Supreme Court was a political appointment. It was hopefully make some black people happy,
right?
Type of deal. Because Johnson was a Southern Dixiecrat,
mm-hmm.
and so he was trying to separate himself from some of those policies.
Right.
He was from Texas, and all of those Georgia, Mississippi, and Carolina governors and senators was his friends.
Yeah, and they show in the film Selma. For people who haven't seen Selma, I think so. We're seeing the reluctance and the sort of the inner conflict. A lot of people got angry. A lot of white liberals got angry about that film because they were like, "Oh, it didn't depict Johnson as the great white hope. Like they always have to have a white person has to be this." No, he was a conflicted.
He was a
human,
political pragmatist.
Right, who was very condescending at first towards King, but then comes around and he's a bit reluctant, but he still did the right things. And there's a scene we talked about Tim Roth earlier with Tupac. Tim Roth plays Wallace in Selma. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah, the same Tim Roth. The story is coming back to Tim Roth, but he he has Tim Roth's character in there, and he's like, I don't want to be remembered like the likes of you. I've seen that scene in a couple of different depictions of Johnson where he says, I want to think of 1985, 1995, which was far into the future.
Legacy.
Right. He ended up dying pretty soon after he left office, though, Johnson. But
he didn't.
But quite a legacy. Yeah. But quite a legacy. I mean.
But I liken Johnson similar to Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't, after the Civil War, he wasn't going to emancipate the slaves. He didn't even want to put black people in the Union Army.
No.
He was convinced by Frederick Douglass and other people around who were saying this needs to be done.
Right. Lincoln, for people who don't realize, is a free soiler. He's not an abolitionist. Free soiler meaning the real reason for the Civil War is the Mexican-American War, which is a war of imperialism that nobody talks about, where America stole most of Mexico, including California, from Mexico, Texas, and New Mexico, right?
Arizona.
And so Arizona. And so they take it, and then there's a question, these are territories, not states. So can Southerners bring slaves there is the real question. And Southerners were like, well, yeah, we have the same rights to them. And Lincoln was like, here's a compromise situation. He did not want to end slavery in the South. He did not. He wanted to say, we're going to let slavery kind of die a natural death now that there's an industrial revolution. So you can't bring your slaves to the West. That's what he meant, free soil. The newly acquired soil is free, but it can stay in the South. That compromise didn't work out. And he was forced into this position by the South, not only constantly attacking, but winning, early on.
When they seceded, that was the thing.
Seceded, and then each one of his generals on the Army of the Potomac was losing over and over and over again. And then Spielberg starts the film, right? If you want to talk about popular misconceptions, Spielberg starts the film Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis. Great performance and everything in 1863. Right? Halfway through. And when I realized that starting to watch the film, it was like 20 minutes in, I'm like, oh, that's it? They're not going to go back to what happened before the middle of the war? I'm done watching this crap, because it was supposed to be a history lesson, that film. And it's like, well, this is really, really trying to do the whole white savior thing. And again, it's not that Lincoln and Johnson didn't do important things. It's that if you want to tell the story honestly, you have to show their reluctance, or you have to show the complexity.
And show the black person who was in their ears.
Exactly.
Saying, this is what you need to do. This is the moral thing that you ought to do.
Right.
This
Why
is
the moral heroism always the bastion, belonging to the white leaders, and never? I mean, I don't think there is a Douglass in the
That's
film.
That's why I tell people, a lot of people don't know about Frederick Douglass, but when people ask me about Frederick Douglass, I said that's the real first black president of the U.S. was Frederick Douglass, because he took his freedom. He learned to read and write when he was young, and so when he realized, and he tried to escape like twice, because he even famously quoted, once you become literate, you realize that slavery is immoral. Like, once you become literate and you can read, the great books of literature, and you see in every great idea that the idea of keeping another human being as a slave is morally wrong. It's a bankrupt approach to life.
So one of the ways you keep that slave is by making sure they never learn how to read and don't understand the concept of moral code, which is always
not only did, when Frederick Douglass finally did leave, the third time he escaped, because he escaped twice and was returned and brutally beaten. But because he was the slave master's son, he wasn't killed. So he just bided his time. He learned how to forge documents with the slave master's signature.
Yeah.
And then before he left, he beat his slave master's ass, whooped him one good time, and then he left. And went to England and started speaking out against slavery, under a new name, Frederick Douglass, because if he used the former slave name that he had, they would have known, this is a wanted runaway that we have here speaking on these stages. And even at one point, when they became aware that that's who he was, he used to have to travel with security to make sure that nobody would try to kidnap him and sell him back into slavery. Because he was a runaway slave. He wrote his story, told his story. And once he did that, he had to watch his back everywhere he went, especially when he came to the U.S. and speaking engagements. He had to speak at abolitionist rallies, and he had to make sure everybody who was vetted, who came in there and who was backstage, and he had to make sure there's no slave patrols, no slave catchers trying to kidnap him, because they would try to do that.
Yeah.
So Frederick Douglass was a dynamic person. I guess.
Incredible figure. And it's funny because I feel like we're venturing back into Black History Month. The last episode we did was Black History Month, and then March 2nd, the day after the end of Black History Month, this year was Ottawa. So one commemoration after another.
One school that I used to work at, we used to always celebrate the two of them together.
Yeah. Like
Black History Month, and then March 1st would always be a celebration of Ottawa.
Is it here?
Here in Ethiopia.
Okay.
Bright Future, which is
right.
African American who started the school. So he always upheld that tradition. And I did a interview on Arts TV the other day, and for me, Black History is 365 days a year. It's not in one particular month.
Which happens to be the shortest month. People have pointed out that it's the shortest.
We understand that too. But the reason why Carter G. Woodson used February for Negro History Week, because that's how it started, was because it was Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, the month that they were both born. Yeah. So that's why he chose February. It wasn't a conspiracy by white people to be the shortest month. We often, I used to use that joke too, but after I learned more about Carter G. Woodson and the reason, because I remember when that same teacher who I was talking about in grade 4, 1967, 68, it was Negro History Week then, but we took the whole month because she wanted us to present a program to the whole school. So we rehearsed what we were going to do for Negro History Week, the whole month of February. So that was the first time I really began to look at Black history as something more than it's something that we hadn't been given. Like my school experience up until that time, I had not been given any Black history. And then after that, until I went to university and enrolled in African studies or Black studies, I didn't get any Black history again. Like it was between 4th grade and college. You just get the basic U.S. history, the model, and then by the time my younger sister was in elementary school, the books changed so that it was one paragraph about slavery.
Right, and it's almost always treated in economic terms. It's like what they got out of it.
Yeah, it was like these cotton plantations, and they largely used slave labor, sugar plantations, and tobacco plantations, and they don't talk about how
moving on
those things made America great.
Exactly. That America is built on. The Industrial Revolution is built on all the agriculture before it, which is built on slave labor free labor for hundreds of years.
And then even the Industrial Revolution again, when they decided, okay, we're going to pay workers, but they didn't pay them anywhere near what they were worth or the value that they brought to the owners of the company.
Yeah. But I mean, what I always amazed at is it's one thing to exploit people. It's one thing to abuse people, to enslave people, to genocide people, to colonize people. But the idea that in the process you can convince yourself and you can convince that person, this is what we were talking about as far as colonialism be a matter of thought, we were talking about yesterday with Iman. The idea that you can convince that person to not just love their chains and so on, but that that you're the lazy one. Stop being so lazy, boy, and go back into your field.
Yeah.
What are you doing? You're just sitting on your chair. But it's
cracking the whip.
Right, cracking the whip. But it's like a godlike thing. Like, I'm inherently hardworking, therefore I don't have to work. You are inherently lazy.
So you have to work
So
hard.
you have to work hard, and even as the harder you work, the lazier you are. The lazier I am, the harder I work. And it's not just with work, right? The idea you're the heathen, you're the savage, you're the violent one, you're the sexual predator. When who's committing the savagery, the predation, you know what I mean, sexually and otherwise. And so, but that's so amazing to me that can be entrenched for hundreds of years in such a way that people know that that's not the case, but they never put two and two together. Like they never put two and together between the predation of these slave owners and whatnot, and the other side, which is the projection of it, right? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, people discuss one or the other, never together.
That was the philosophy, though. You could have somebody's body as your property, but you had to control their mind before you could really control that body.
Yeah,
and that was the whole thing. Like, they had to control the minds. So I think we discussed this before. They would take the biggest black buck and brutalize them in front of the whole slave population. This is what happens if you stand up, you talk back, if you do anything like that. They tie him to horses and have him pulled apart, or they burn him alive, or they do something horrific in front of the whole
cutting off hands, cutting off legs, yeah.
And if you tried to run away, things like of that nature, or put wild dogs on them or anything like that. But they would make the whole slave population
watch. And then they would often make the argument, because, by the way, for people who don't know, what was this guy's name? Tim Wise, I think is his name. Tim Wise? He's a white guy who's like an anti-racist advocate. He makes some interesting arguments, a little full of himself, bit of a virtue signaler, but he makes the point about denial and how deeply entrenched denial is. Going back to the 19th century, I don't know if we talked about this last time, but the slave owners would say, well, why don't they run away? I mean, we're doing them a favor, these heathens. Well, maybe it's because you make a spectacle of their dismemberment if they run away. And then, then you get to the 20th century, during the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of white people, the majority, according to Gallup polls, felt that racism was not real and that they have no idea why these black people are complaining about. And today, people, there's a black president. This is what we were talking about before, the use of the I have a dream. So, okay, the dream has been fulfilled. Now stop whining. And it's like, denial is the key to the perpetuation of the problem. Because when you don't acknowledge something, the key to changing a problem is to acknowledge it. So the key to not solving a problem and perpetuating is to keep denying it. These efforts of denial are so powerful. And my only question to anybody who believes that it's different now. Now there's no racism. Like, what are the chances that the people who were right all along, because we would all acknowledge who was right all along during slavery and civil rights, are suddenly wrong, and the people who are wrong all along are suddenly right? What are the chances of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the reality. Again, like a lot of times I would be asked by people from outside the U.S., why didn't black people resist slavery more? Or why? And I guess I say it was an insidious system. You have to understand the whole system, how it was imposed. It's not a case of just you take a bunch of black people from Africa and say, okay, you're slaves now. No, it was from the time they captured them that they continually humiliate and abase them to the point where when they bring them to a strange place. And again, the whip, they're separated from people who they can understand their language. Right.
Run away where, right? I mean, you can run away, but like where exactly are you going to go? Yeah. You no idea where you are.
No idea where you are. Yeah. You have no idea where you're going. In some places in the South, especially if you run this direction, you run into a swamp with alligators and deadly cottonmouth snakes and stuff
You
like
think
that.
about the experience of being brought over, and all those things that all so many black population have to deal with. It must be hell in a beyond our ability to reckon with hell. You know what I mean? Like to be lost
Here's
in that
a
place and put in that situation must be.
here's a thing. Like often in America, what they have sympathy for is prisoners of war during World War II. Prisoners of war who were captured by the Japanese. There's lots of stories on how they were treated by the Japanese.
John McCain by the Vietnamese. Right.
Vietnam, Korea.
Right.
All of those conflicts produced prisoners of war.
Right.
And how those prisoners were mentally and physically subjugated. The things that they had to go through. And that was oftentimes it wasn't more than 3 or 4 years that they were there. So just imagine now that type of humiliation, subjugation taking place over a period of hundreds of years. And then so the descendants of those people are inheriting a thought process that these people are superior. These people have all the guns and the weapons. These people own all the property. So you're raised, as you're born, this is the system you're born into. So a lot of people don't really understand how insidious and how far this system was imposed upon us. It's not something you could just say, oh, well, I'm not going to be a slave, or they couldn't make me be a slave. Like I hear a lot of people say that, people today who have their 21st century mentality now, and they say, oh, well, I could never have been a slave, or I'd have been dead.
Yeah, you have no idea. If you were raised into a society where you were always, or you're captured and transposed into a world that you don't even know where the hell you are, you would not be you. So you could say I would never be a slave, but you would not be you if you were a slave, right? No, I know exactly what you mean.
And then all of us who are alive today are descendants of those people,
right?
Who
toiled and we are also inheriting the fruits of their labor, because that's what has built the industrialized West and the global capitalist society. I will say that it's worth acknowledging in fairness that of course African societies enslaved each other quite a bit, and that we had slavery, and this is to the credit of Haile Selassie, whom you hold dear, as many Rastafarians do, that this is one of his greatest early signal achievements is ending slavery here.
Yeah. But there's still a mentality that people look at people and say, oh, he's just a slave.
Yeah.
They still think
that way, yeah.
So you can imagine how it's not that simple to just write on a piece of paper, slavery is abolished.
Yeah.
Even though they did it in the U.S. in 1865, that doesn't erase the mentality from the people. Just because you write on it, and even the reason why they celebrate Juneteenth is because even 2 years after that document was written, some black people were still toiling as slaves in some parts of the U.S. until the federal government actually went to them and said, yeah, you people are free, right? The president signed this in law 2 years ago, or they read it out.
They had no idea,
And people had no idea.
Right. What does it mean if it's not codified? We had a discussion about constitutions a couple weeks ago, about how everything needs to be codified, otherwise it's just a piece of paper. Brown versus Board of Education, which the famous lines at the end, with all deliberate speed. And one of the black people were trying to figure out, what does that mean? When did desegregation of schools happen? With all deliberate speed. And then he read the dictionary. What does deliberate mean? It says slow. So with all slow speed, take your time, with all slow speed. So this is why people have this conspiratorial mentality if you're black, because you see the manipulations hiding better. But I will say this, me personally, my own story, the more I reflect back on it, I told you about having been a teacher at the same school that I was at and how that went, and having been in international school and whatever, and sounding white, which I will never sit here and try to sound black, because A, I don't know what that means, and B, I would probably sound ridiculous if I ever tried. It was nothing
like you.
Yeah, exactly. But
that's
a
a
lot of that
ridiculous
is
idea.
It is, what did you say at the beginning? What is
There's no color to a sound.
Yeah, what does sound look like? What does sound look like? But my own experience, I think a lot of that is born out of, people might misunderstand it as self-hatred or self-denial or something. What I was really dealing with was that I was not aware of the fact that other people maintain those perceptions, right? Like I could say that I freed myself mentally because I had good parents. I was Ethiopian, you know what I mean. I believed in independence. I never had this mentality. Oh, I was descended from slaves, or because I look a certain way. I just didn't accept it. I thought it doesn't matter. Just because you feel that it doesn't matter, you internally, yes, liberate yourself, but don't ever confuse the fact that the world is not going to see you that way, right? And that was the mistake I always made. Was I thought that as long as I don't see it that way, who cares what the other world thinks? Oh no, it still matters. Still matters what the rest of the world thinks, right? A lot of times the debates over racism, the misunderstanding is the conflation of what is and what ought to be, the is ought fallacy, right? Just because it ought to be, racism ought not exist, which everybody at least
Acknowledge.
yeah, at least out loud would acknowledge. Of course, nobody wants to acknowledge that they're racist, and the vast majority of the people of the world think racism, tribalism, ethnicity is ridiculous. But anybody who's being honest knows that it is not that way, and that if anything, tribal, ethnic, bloodline divisions, I think have gotten worse in much of the world, probably since the end of the Soviet Union, when everybody kind of abandoned ideological difference, and then now nobody fights over ideology, nobody fights over politics. I was talking to a person from the student movement, an older person, some time ago when Civil War started here, and I was like, I think I mentioned, what would you guys have thought when you were in the '60s? The people were, your age basically, right? Or maybe a little older. What would you have thought in the '60s growing up, seeing maps of Africa where entire swaths are owned by Britain or owned by France, and you're fighting for liberation? It's the '60s, and there's all this possibility in the hippie movement and the student movement. And to think that 50, 60, 70 years later, in the future, 2022, a date that it does not compute, just like to us, 2092 doesn't compute, that people would be fighting over tribal war all over the world.
Yeah,
you would have thought, oh, humanity is on a downward course spiral of devolution, right?
Yeah,
and maybe it is. Maybe it is.
Where we thought in the '60s that we were approaching the age of Aquarius, a new
dawn consciousness,
a new state of mind, and that people around the world, because of airplane flights, and the world was getting smaller.
Yeah,
you could fly to this part of the world, a place that you only dreamed about before. Some places that you never even dreamed you could even ever see, and now people were flying to, like Nixon went to China in the '70s. You know what I'm saying? Like these things.
Oh my goodness, China! He flew to China. Yeah.
And this is like big
right.
They went to the moon, and they went to all these places. Yeah. So.
They went to the moon before they went to China. As it turns out, they went to the moon a few years before they went to China.
Yeah. So, but the point I'm making is that all of this money was spent to go all these places, and then what really happened was people in those places were suffering, like in the U.S.,
right,
in China, in all of those places, and maybe even the moon. We don't know, but people are there suffering. Sure. And people just go there and visit and make some speeches and then go back home.
Right. To other people who are suffering.
Yeah.
But the people making the speeches are suffering, right? This is the Buddha story. The guy who's the prince, Siddhartha, who's in his palace, who wasn't aware, and then he goes out one day, ventures, and he sees all these poor people suffering. But then he realizes, but wait, I was suffering too. Rich people suffered too. Suffering is just an inherent part of the human condition. It amazes me that
my suffering was different than these people suffering.
Yeah,
and people who are in more humble situations tend to embrace their suffering, or not let their suffering define them.
Not let it define them. Absolutely. But it just amazes me that all that hope that I mean, you're old enough to remember the '60s, right? Old enough to the hope that existed for people in the '60s, even into the '70s, in early '70s in Ethiopia, and all that has been replaced by this. I mean, is there any end in sight to bloodline?
For me,
conflicts.
When for me, the reality, the earth-shaking reality, was when the hope was crushed. Was when I realized that the United States of America went to war against the Black Panther Party and anybody affiliated, associated with them. That the counterintelligence program, the COINTELPRO, that they enacted, and then they enlisted, and all the local police, law enforcement agencies to cooperate in this particular vision that these Black Panthers, they only want to kill police. That's what they want to do. They want to overturn, and they want to.
It's more like the police wants to kill the Panther.
Well, again, that's what they created.
Sure,
because once you tell all of these police agencies that this is what the Panthers want to do, they're arming themselves and they want to wipe you out and your way of life.
Yeah.
Then your thought is, well, we better get them first.
Yeah.
And that's what was unleashed against the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party was just idealistic young men and women who thought that they could get some political power for Black people. Yeah. Finally.
I've been working on a chapter for a book that I've been developing on the French Connection, the film from 1971. You ever see that film with Gene Hackman?
I did.
Great performance. I was actually just watching it on my phone as you were coming in. I was rewatching it, really trying to understand it, because there's something really shocking about that film. It's the first R-rated film. This is 50 years ago this month. 50 years ago this month, Hollywood gave the first R-rated film to win Best Picture. They gave it Best Picture, and it's a brilliant film in a lot of ways. The performances, the direction, and all that. I love the film, but it's so fascinating that on the poster of the film, there's Gene Hackman. On the poster, they put the cop, is racist cop, Popeye Doyle in New York, who was abusing all these Black people, just harassing everybody. He's an anti-hero. You're not supposed to like him, but at the same time, he's the main character, right? Mm-hmm. He shoots one of these French guys, these drug dealers, in the back after having chased them along the subway. Shoots him in the back, and they put that on the poster. And the audiences were erupting, and apparently the cop that it was based on, this guy Egan, was like, I can't believe that you guys would do it. Or actually, he didn't say anything, which is why they put it in there. But a lot of police officers were like, we would never do that. We would never murder someone in cold blood, cowardly, shooting him in the back, right? And so the film, but everybody celebrates. Now, by the end of the film, you realize that this guy's a scumbag. He's even willing to let his one of his fellow cops die, as long as he gets his men or whatever. So the film is redeemed in a sense, but it's so interesting to me that liberal Hollywood and all that would and all these audiences in 71, as late as 71, would celebrate. Apparently there was thunderous applause as the racist scummy police officer shoots an unarmed man who's fleeing the scene in the back. And today, I mean, with all the incidences of this, that has a different kind of meaning, different kind of resonance for people.
Yeah, well, even the real story is that the French Connection was bringing heroin into New York in the inner city,
right? And
how that was connected with the war in Indochina.
Right.
Which was, formerly French Indonesia,
mm-hmm.
Vietnam, and Laos and Thailand. That was all French
mm-hmm.
before in the 50s. And the U.S. took over that proxy war
mm-hmm.
against, and then again, they coded it in terms of, we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting against the communists. But the whole thing was about the drugs.
Right. And it's funny because the other level to the name French Canadian, which is a weird title for a cop movie in the States, right? But the other level, then they wanted to rename it, but the director insisted because he also was inspired by French New Wave filmmakers, like especially Jean-Luc Godard and their kind of stuff with all the jump cuts and stuff. What action movies all do now was kind of invented in the 60s. So that's one meaning of French Connection. Another one is the geopolitical alliance between, and all the other ways in which France and the United States, in spite of their constant enmity, are always on the same side of every war, and they're the two countries that are based off of Enlightenment principles, and so the other one is the heroin connection of the
again, yeah. So that those things are the things that led me to make a decision that I had to not live in the United States anymore.
Part of it is drugs, as you mean?
Drugs, not just the fact that, but how the drugs are particularly targeting the blacks and the minority communities.
Yeah.
Primarily. And again, like I said, it's conspiracy theories and whatnot, but to me, it's not a coincidence that these things were targeted and dumped in inner cities.
Right. Oh, no, of course not. I mean, I think the CIA documentation on that has confirmed what everybody suspected for a long time. But have you noticed, bringing it back to Ethiopia, have you noticed an influx, as I have in the last, you've been here 15 years, I've been coming here about 25, 30 years since I was a child. Have you noticed an influx in significant increase in the use and the distribution of narcotics? I mean, it didn't used to be this way. It used to be chat and some marijuana and some here and there in certain corners, but it's fair to say that we're facing this similar problem with not just narcotics, but the sort of the illnesses of despair that are tied to the economy, that are tied to other social problems. But I've noticed it when it comes to narcotics in Ethiopia. It didn't used to be a thing, right?
Yeah, you're right, and part of it is like you're saying, it's socio-economic. Some people feel like they're more modern, like if they mimic the West and the type of drugs that they're taking or using, that they are showing their modernity, because this is what rich people in this part of the world do, and this is what you understand.
Sure. I mean, it's a cool kids thing, but at the same time, heroin is one thing, but cocaine and the crack epidemic. I mean, the fact that in the '80s the same drug had penalties that were 100 times worse for people smoking crack than people snorting cocaine, just because of the cocaine was the rich person's version of crack, exactly. And or crack was the poor version of coke, and as a result, if they had gone after people who were doing coke, they would have been going after their own kids or their own friends at Wall Street, or maybe some themselves.
So you see, it's a hypocritical system, because they design and they create, and then they punish those who don't look like them, that are indulging in the same things that, again, they're getting rich from.
Right.
So the hypocrisy, all of those things, those are major reasons what made me like just analyzing it and saying, I can't live in a place that advocate the government policy is we're going to go after these black people because we deem them dangerous. That, to me, I couldn't abide that. So maybe it's overly simplistic way of looking at it, but that's just the way that's what I came out when I saw the COINTELPRO and what they were doing and how they targeted, how they assassinated Fred Hampton in Chicago and harassed and assassinated leaders from all over the country. Geronimo Pratt went to jail for 25 years for a crime he did not commit, and that the CIA had evidence that he didn't commit. They had wiretaps from him being at a meeting in Oakland at the time this murder took place in Santa Monica. But because it was an illegal wiretap, they couldn't let people know that, okay, that guy's innocent because we heard him in another meeting during that time. No, they let him go to jail for 25 years before, after freedom of information, they finally got the evidence that was able to set him free. By then he had contracted cancer in prison, and he got a settlement of millions of dollars, and then he came to Tanzania and built some infrastructure there, and he was buried there.
Yeah.
So this,
wow.
This is what happened to people,
right?
And Geronimo Pratt was a Vietnam veteran.
Yeah.
He came back, and instead of using his skills to fight for America, he decided, I'm going to join the local Black Panther Party and teach them some military skill. But a lot of the people that were in the Black Panther Party at that time were informants working for the FBI, the CIA, all these people. They were the ones who were saying, oh, we need guns. I can get some guns. You know what I'm saying? And then when they get the guns,
Yeah.
So then the police come in and crack down on them because we hear they got a lot of guns, so we got to serve a no-knock warrant,
right.
Which means we go in shooting. We go in and shooting, and whatever happens. And they promoted in the newspaper, well, these are criminals. They had all these weapons. Obviously they weren't up to no good, but they were just defending themselves because they were aware that the police were coming to try to kill them.
Right. I mean, I think all of this is part of when you talk about how modern or the cool kids or the rich kids are doing it. It's Western. This mentality when we have this is the downside of the influx of modern penetration of Ethiopia, of a traditional religious sort of conservative society is now we have with it drugs, we have other forms of crime, but also the informant is an example of, it's a moral crime or it's a spiritual crime, like to give up somebody, to snitch, you're doing what the law wants you to do and what the police requires to informants to bring down crime organizations, but you're giving somebody up to spare yourself, and so that goes back to the whole illnesses of despair and sort of everything else that is sort of like kind of a spiritual and moral crisis that is tied to to a crisis of whether it's narcotics or that which comes with the economy. So sometimes modernity is not always, you know what I mean? It's not always a blessing.
Poor people on drugs are trying to escape. Rich people on drugs are making money from drugs.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So that's what we have to. So why don't they target the people who are making the money from the drugs?
Yeah.
Who they target is these low level. And again, in the neighborhood, you might have what you think is a lot of money. You got a nice car, you got all the latest shoes and stuff, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to like wealth that some of these drug kingpins have amassed over the years.
But all of these drug
targeting these young kids who are just, their first time they got, some ready cash.
Yeah.
And they feel like they're making it in life. They're fulfilling the American dream. They bought mommy a house. They did this, they did that. So they feel it. And then the federal government come in and they take the house and they take
and you're worse off than you were. But all these the drug game is part of all of these games where the crap rolls down the hill. Right, like as you said, like the rich. You look at a problem like narcotics. You look at a problem like crime. You look at problems, any number of social problems. Almost always is yet another way. Yeah, somebody rich is making themselves richer.
Yeah.
I mean, some years ago, the UN came out and said, "What is the real challenge facing the world today? The real crisis?" And they said it's the growing gap between the rich and the poor. And I mean, maybe that's also. I think that's tied to what we've also seen since the end, really, of ideology, not the end of history, as they called it at the time, but the end of ideology as we know it. And when the Soviet Union fell, and you had this international liberal world order, which is to say, more and more people are divided along ethnic lines, tribal lines, racial lines, and more people are, there's a kind of constant. Everybody's just trying to get rich quick, and if you either make it or you don't. We've had this breakdown of a lot of social. We're seeing this in Ethiopia too. Breakdown of social structures. Yeah.
And it's just like you were saying. It's always these different. Like when you started to watch movies in the 80s and 90s, you always saw, there's these Albanians, or there's these Ukrainians, or there's these, somebody. There's always, they try to introduce somebody in the movies as the bad guy. This Eastern European bad guys, quote unquote. Because after the fall of the Soviet Union, all of those countries that became independent, you started to see people in those areas become super rich.
Yeah.
And always, speculation was there's arms dealing, there's drug dealing, there's all kind of underworld economy that makes a lot of people very rich. And those
oligarchs in Russia too.
They're the ones who go and buy
oil,
property, and invest in oil and invest in. So
we're seeing some of that here, is what you're saying?
We're seeing it's the same thing.
Right.
It's nothing new under the sun, right? So
it comes with capitalism, whereas a few make it, and then the vast majority are just going to be left behind and have very little safety net.
And that's the capitalist vision. You find a product that people want, and you sell it to them for profit.
And everything is profit driven.
And you turn it over and you put more of that back in the market.
And when social policy and social institutions, education, health, as is the case in America and really nowhere else in the industrialized world, are entirely driven by profit as well. I mean, that's a disturbing kind of phenomenon. But I guess what we're both agreeing on is that these are sort of the perils of modernization and some of the areas where maybe traditions are. We could turn to traditions rather than modernity, and that's also part of resistance, right? Yeah. That's also part of the meaning of something like Ottawa. It's not just a racial resistance.
No.
There's often a class aspect to it, and there's also just a sense of as Bob Marley said, we refuse to be what you wanted us to be. We are who you are, and that's the way it's going to be, right?
Or as he said, in quoting Marcus Garvey, he said, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, because none but ourselves free our minds." And a lot of these things are mental slavery, how we are chained to ideas of what success is. So we have an idea, and it's based on what we've seen on television or what we've seen examples from other people who are lauded as, captains of industry. And really, the bottom line is that some of them were bootleggers and drug dealers. And in the history of America, a lot of the people who are lauded as the capitalists who brought the industrial revolution to its fullness, and who caused the Great Depression were these people who they were robber barons collecting land, taking land from people and running railroads through all of these things. This is how they became rich.
Yeah. I mean, you look at American history long enough, you start to see scam after scam after scam, con after con after con. And unfortunately, that is one aspect of the Americanization, the Westernization of Ethiopia is I'm noticing a lot of get rich quick stuff, a lot of, little schemes, little cons, and sometimes they're tied to a particular ideology, or particular political movement. Sometimes they're tied to a religious organization. Sometimes they're tied to just individuals just being. Sometimes they're tied to different kinds of companies, different kinds of businesses. But there is that tendency that advent of entire industries around conning people. Get rich quick schemes, Ponzi schemes of that. And that's part of what you get when you have an international liberal world order. I still think that so much of this is not just traced back to Ottawa, but right around the time that the government changed here 30 years ago, and governments were changing everywhere. Not really an Ethiopian problem, but what we had, which was the creation of an international liberal order. And somebody called it the end of history. Fukuyama called it the end of history, but really you see it in the generations. Older folks like yourself from an older generation have a sense of sacrifice to something greater, education for the purpose of a cause, or people who fought in World War II, people who were around in the 60s and 70s. And my generation has, not to sound too pessimistic, but has, ethnicity and the latest con, the latest get rich quick scheme. It's really sad. It's really sad. Right. So hopefully, on to wrap up. I think it's time we wrap up. It's hard to stop when you're in here.
We start talking.
Yeah. When you're in here, especially, I have a hard time finding a way to put it, because I want to keep talking to you.
We get stimulated to thinking about different things.
Absolutely. But to wrap it up, on a day of Ottawa, on a day of resistance, on a day of fighting for a greater cause beyond yourself, and the consciousness that is necessary for any such resistance. Hopefully we can also consider
tap into that spirit.
Tap into that spirit when it comes not just to nationalist resistance or Ethiopia against the rest of, but to resistance and consciousness in any number of other contexts.
Yeah. Well, again, and taking it back to what we talked about before, the school days. When again the seminal line at the end was Lawrence Fishburne going all around the campus with the bells ringing, saying, "Wake up!
Please wake up!
Wake up!" That's really what it is. Like the people. I saw this interesting piece of art today. It was these big guys sitting around the table, and they had some kind of game board, but the table that the game board was resting on was the backs of darker people who were on their knees, but they had this round table on top of their back.
I've seen that imagery somewhere. Yeah.
And I think it was, and then the caption read that when the people stand up, the game is over.
Right.
Which it was so like illustrated right there, because these fat cats are sitting around this board game, but it's on the backs. This board game is on the backs of the poor people.
Sometimes all you have to do is nothing.
So
sometimes all you have to do is not participate. I mean, like I haven't voted in an American election in 14 years. And that was 2008. I didn't vote for a while. I voted for a third party candidate. And my argument was always, if I don't agree with the system, all I have to do is not participate in it. All of us have to do is not participate in it. And the system crumbles overnight, or it loses legitimacy, which is what the system is fueled on. And so all everybody has to do is not, if they're really whining about the system, you don't have to do anything. Just don't do anything. Don't legitimize it. But they bombard you with that, you have to vote. You have to prevent the enemies, the bad guys on the right or the bad guys on the left.
No, even they taking over. I worked in a job where they gave you incentive. If you volunteered and worked for the electoral board, you didn't have to come to work and you still got paid.
Oh, there you go.
So it's incentive. So you're incentivized. But even then, I had my personal statement. I didn't vote.
Yeah.
But I still worked for because.
I don't think voting in the United States. I mean, in other countries, here maybe, but voting in the United States is kind of indefensible to me. Like if you really are a person of our
mentality or our approach. Or
conscious
of this.
I think I voted in my whole life. I voted once in 1984. I voted for Jesse Jackson. I did.
Oh, nice. Well, that's defensive.
And
that's defensive. Shirley Chisholm, you weren't of age at the time.
I was not.
Yeah, 72, I think.
I think just because it was Jesse and it was like everybody was voting for black people at that time.
Yeah. Harold Washington.
Yeah. So, but
comes into mind.
I didn't have any real faith in the system. I just did it just to be supportive of a black person. But in reality, I started to examine it then because look, first of all, most places when you vote, you get to vote for something or against something, or you can vote to abstain because you don't agree with the choices.
Right. See, I like that, but they don't allow that.
They don't have that.
Yeah. That's a key. Yeah, voting to abstain. Yeah.
Yeah. See, if we had the vote to abstain,
ooh, yeah, they got to get rid of that.
That would be a powerful statement.
That would be the biggest political party in America. I mean, people have pointed out that the biggest party in America is the non-voter party because no matter what they say about their democracy, I could go on for hours talking about all the problems with American. Claims to democracy, but half the population that is,
I don't agree with any of the candidates. I don't agree with these policies. I don't agree.
Yeah.
If you had that right, that to me is a real democracy.
I mean, half of the voter, the eligible electorate chooses not to vote on any given American election. What does that tell you? That's twice as much as will vote for any one.
I was part of that number again from the time from 1984. I was registered, but I didn't vote.
Yeah, because that means that a quarter of the eligible electorate is responsible for putting the president into office. If you assume that the winning party gets about 50,
that was one that they were complaining and talking about Obama. It's only like 40% of the registered electorate voted in that election,
and I think that was more than most.
And that was why Trump was able to electrify that silent majority, that non-voting.
And still, there's a lot of people
racial lines. That was a deliberate attempt on his part.
Right.
And he was able to do it successfully. Have you seen that documentary, the 4 Hours in the Capitol? Did you watch that?
No, I haven't. See, I haven't been watching a lot of new films. I've been going back and watching The French Connection and stuff like that.
I recommend.
Right.
That documentary, 4 Hours.
Please write it down for me as well.
And another one was Attica.
Attica. Oh, there's a new one?
Yeah. Well, it was made like just 2021.
Oh, I gotta see that. I gotta see that.
Yeah, it was nominated for an award this year.
Single greatest bloodshed since the Civil War of civilians in a confrontation since the Civil War was the rebellion of prisoners in Attica.
Yeah, you watch that. That really tells that breaks down American society because again, at the time it took place and what was going on, and Nixon was president, and it's very telling about the system of the United States, how they viewed people, black and brown people especially.
Yeah,
this is a microcosm, this prison in upstate New York, but it kind of shows
absolutely.
Because all the people who lived in that town either worked for or was part of the prison economy.
Mm-hmm.
So they had their point of view, and then the people who were in the prison, most of the black and brown prisoners came from Brooklyn and Bronx and Harlem and those places, and they shipped them to this prison in upstate New York.
I have to see this. I'll definitely write that down. As you're leaving, Timothy, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I always really enjoy having you on. I learn so much from you every time I sit down.
I appreciate this opportunity to sit down and talk.
Yeah,
because a lot of people don't want to hear me on my soapbox talking about stuff I talk about.
Please stay on your soapbox.
But I feel like it's important, especially here in Ethiopia, that people understand why African American would leave the U.S. and come to
when so many people are trying to go over there.
So I think they need to understand all the reasons, and it's not just because I don't like. I mean, there's a lot of things I love about America as far as the land, and my family's still there, and a lot of things too. But the governmental policies, and especially how they went to war against black people in the 60s, I could never abide or live in a country like that. So that's just me.
All right. Thanks a lot, Timothy. Come back. Please come back soon.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening, for watching.
Next time I'll come and do my poetry.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We'll do that as soon as you can, maybe next week or something. we can come back and do our first poetry episode as well.
Right.
You've been listening to Ras Temari Radio, or viewing Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we discuss everything about politics. Thanks a lot, everybody.
How long did we go?
2 hours
2 hours?
Just 2 hours?
and a half.
Shorter than
2.5 hours.